Welcome. Get comfortable. Pull the blanket up. Turn the light down a little lower than you think you need to. Tonight we are going somewhere familiar. A place you have probably visited hundreds of times without ever realizing how strange it actually is. A place with a nuclear power plant and a tire fire, and a gorge, and a harbor, and a monorail, and mountains, and deserts, and ocean, all somehow within driving distance of each other. A place where the fish have three eyes, where a billionaire has been alive since before the Spanish-American War, where a baby once shot a man and the whole town collectively shrugged and moved on. We are going to Springfield. And we are going to stay there for a long time tonight. This is not a loud video. This is not a countdown list read at you like a sports broadcast. This is a slow, careful walk through 36 years of mysteries, buried storylines, fan theories so thoroughly constructed that the show's own writers have been forced to respond to them on the record, and a version of Springfield that sits just underneath the surface of the comedy, darker and stranger and more melancholy than anything the show has ever openly acknowledged. Some of what we discuss tonight has canonical evidence buried in the show itself. Some of it is fan theory, the kind of theory that the internet has spent decades building and refining and arguing over. Some of it is the kind of observation that, once you hear it, you cannot stop seeing it every time you watch an episode. All of it is Springfield. So, settle in. Close your eyes if you want to. Let the words wash over you. We are going to take our time here. There is no rush. Springfield has been waiting for 36 years. It can wait a little longer. Section 1. The nuclear contamination theory. Let's begin with the theory that explains everything. Not most things. Not the majority of the strange things that happen in Springfield. Everything. Every yellow face, every impossible survival, every character quirk that the show presents as personality, and the theory argues, is symptom. Every continuity error, every physical impossibility, every moment where a person does something or survives something or forgets something that no real human being would do or survive or forget. One theory covers all of it. The Springfield nuclear power plant is poisoning the entire town, not as a metaphor, not as a background joke that the writers sprinkle in for flavor. As a literal, ongoing, decades-long environmental catastrophe that the show has been documenting since its earliest seasons, while simultaneously ensuring that no character within the show ever notices it clearly enough to stop it. Take a moment to think about that. A show that has been on the air since the 17th of December, 1989, running for 36 seasons and nearly 800 episodes, quietly building a case for a theory that would explain its entire premise, and then burying that case inside jokes and background gags and episodes that move too fast for the audience to stop and ask the obvious question. The obvious question being, if the fish have three eyes, what is happening to the people? We will get there. First, let's establish what we actually know about the plant itself, because the show has given us a remarkable amount of information about it across its run, and almost none of that information is reassuring. What we know about the plant. The Springfield nuclear power plant is a 2-unit pressurized water reactor facility. It is owned and operated by Charles Montgomery Burns, a man whose age the show has placed somewhere north of 100 years old, depending on which episode you are watching. The plant is the primary source of electrical power for the entire town of Springfield, which means that every person living in that community is dependent on it, which means that every person living in that community is dependent on Burns, which means that Burns holds a kind of power over Springfield that goes far beyond the economic. He controls the lights. When a surprise safety inspection was conducted at the plant, a canonical event depicted in the show inspectors found 342 separate violations. Not 3, not 12. 342 distinct ways in which the facility was operating outside the boundaries of safe nuclear management. The estimated cost to bring the plant up to regulatory code was $56 million. Burns refused to spend it. This is not a man who could not afford $56 million. Burns is a billionaire many times over. The show has depicted him possessing wealth so vast that he barely notices $56 million as a quantity. He refused to spend the money not because it would have broken him, but because spending it would have meant acknowledging the violations existed, and acknowledging the violations existed would have meant someone might start asking questions about what those violations had already done to the water, to the air, to the people who had been living downwind of those cracked cooling towers for years, So he refused. And the violations continued. Now, let us be specific about what some of those violations actually were, because the show does not merely gesture at the idea of a dangerous facility. It shows you the danger in careful, incremental detail across dozens of episodes. Radioactive waste being dumped directly into bodies of water. This is not theoretical. The show depicts it. Radioactive waste being dumped onto children's playgrounds. A playground, where children play. Plutonium being used as a paperweight on a desk inside the facility. Sitting there, on the desk, like a rock someone brought back from a vacation. Cooling towers patched with chewing gum. The structural containment of an active nuclear reactor, sealed with gum. Luminous rats running through the facility's lower levels. Rats that glow. In a nuclear power plant. That are never caught, never exterminated, and never mentioned again after the episode in which they appear. And then there is the detail that the show drops almost casually and never revisits. The one that should have generated headlines within Springfield's universe. The one that should have had federal investigators at the door within the week. Human skeletons in the basement. Not one skeleton. Skeletons. Plural. In the basement of an active nuclear power plant. The show shows them to you and then moves on. No one investigates. No one asks who those people were. No one questions how human remains ended up inside a working reactor facility that has presumably been open to some form of regulatory oversight over the decades. The show just shows you the bones and keeps going. And the man whose job it is to prevent all of this, the man whose literal title is safety inspector, the man who is supposed to stand between this facility and the public it serves, is Homer Simpson. Homer Simpson, a man whose IQ the show's creator has placed at 55. A man whose cognitive function was, as revealed in a later season, physically reduced by a crayon that had been lodged in his brain since childhood. A man who sleeps at his workstation. A man who eats donuts when the meltdown warning lights go off. A man who, in one of the most perfectly constructed gags in the show's history, caused a nuclear incident by throwing a donut into the reactor core because he wanted to see if it would grow bigger. That is the safety inspector. That is the man standing between Springfield and radioactive catastrophe. And he has been standing there, failing at that job for over 3 decades. Blinky and the question nobody asked. The first visible evidence of the theory appears in Season 2 of the show. A fish is pulled from a river near the nuclear power plant. The fish has 3 eyes. The fish's name, as the show gives it, is Blinky. And Blinky becomes, briefly, national news within the universe of the show. A gubernatorial candidate uses Blinky as a campaign issue. He argues, with entirely reasonable logic, that a 3-eyed fish pulled from a river downstream of a nuclear facility is evidence of environmental contamination. He argues that Burns is poisoning the environment around Springfield. Burns is ultimately forced to eat the fish on live television to demonstrate that it is harmless. The crowd watches. The candidate loses. The news cycle moves on. Nobody tests the river. Nobody conducts a follow-up study. Nobody pulls another fish out to see if Blinky was a fluke or the beginning of a pattern. Nobody asks the obvious question. If the fish have 3 eyes, what is happening to the people drinking the same water? The show never answers this question out loud. But the theory argues that it has been answering it quietly, in the background, through the physical appearance and biological behavior of every single resident of Springfield for 36 years. Look at Homer Simpson. Really look at him. The overbite so pronounced it defines the lower half of his face. The eyes that bulge from his skull in a way that does not resemble normal human ocular anatomy. The 4 fingers on each hand, a detail that the show applies universally to every Springfield resident and explains away as an animation choice, though the theory has something more specific to say about that. The skull shape, the body that absorbs punishment that would kill an ordinary human being with routine and almost cheerful consistency. Homer has been shot. He has been electrocuted. He has fallen off cliffs. He has been hit by cars. He has been in explosions. He has absorbed the kind of physical trauma that would end most people permanently, and he recovers from all of it at a rate that defies medical explanation. His pain tolerance is inhuman. His healing rate is inhuman. His cognitive capacity is, to put it charitably, well below clinical normal. And he has worked, for his entire adult life, in direct proximity to an active nuclear reactor with 342 safety violations and glowing rats and plutonium used as office decoration. The glow, the most elegant piece of evidence for the contamination theory, comes from a Season 8 episode called The Springfield Files, and it is elegant precisely because the show itself treats it as a comedy premise, while the theory argues it is the most damning piece of evidence in the canon. Homer sees something in the woods near Springfield, a glowing figure, moving strangely, emitting visible light in the darkness of the forest. Homer, quite reasonably given the context, assumes he has seen an alien. The whole town panics. The FBI sends agents. The episode builds toward a dramatic reveal. And when the reveal comes, the glowing figure in the woods is not an alien. It is Mr. Burns. Burns undergoes a weekly medical treatment so intensive, so loaded with chemicals, and what the show implies is some form of radiation therapy, that the treatment causes his body to emit a visible green glow for a period after each session. The treatments keep him alive for exactly 1 more week. Without them, he dies. The margin is that precise. Miss 1 appointment and Burns is gone. After each treatment session, Burns wanders out of the medical facility in a dazed, euphoric state, stumbling through the forest near Springfield like a creature from some other world, because in a very real sense, that is what he is. A man so saturated with experimental treatments for what amounts to chronic radiation poisoning that his body produces light. He glows in the dark, literally, not as a metaphor. And the people of Springfield see this glowing humanoid figure moving through the trees near their town, near their nuclear power plant, and their first thought is not radiation. Their first thought is not the plant. Their first thought is alien life from outer space. That is how deep the town's collective inability to connect the obvious dots actually runs. A glowing figure near a nuclear power plant, and the community reaches for space travel as the explanation before it reaches for radiation contamination. The theory says this is not stupidity. The theory says this is symptom. The people themselves. Here is the detail that makes the contamination theory click into place with an almost audible sound. When guest characters appear in Springfield, when celebrities visit or outsiders arrive from somewhere beyond the town's borders, they look different. Not slightly different, meaningfully different. Their proportions are more natural. Their eyes are set into their faces the way human eyes are actually set. Their features align more closely with realistic human anatomy. The show draws visitors and outsiders with a different visual grammar than it draws Springfield residents. The standard explanation for this is animation style. The Simpsons has a distinctive aesthetic, and outsiders are drawn to contrast with that aesthetic for comedic effect. But the theory looks at that same visual difference and sees something else. Within the logic of the show's own universe, there is an observable, visible difference between the people who live inside Springfield and the people who do not. The people inside the contamination zone have certain physical characteristics. The people outside it do not. The yellow skin, the overbites, the bulging eyes, the 4 fingers. The hair that maintains impossible shapes without product, in Marge's case growing straight up in a tower that defies gravity and physics in equal measure and has maintained that exact shape for 36 years. Every Springfield resident shares these traits. No one from outside the town shares them. The visual difference between insider and outsider is consistent across hundreds of episodes and dozens of guest characters. And the show's explanation is, that is just the art style. The theory's explanation is, that is mutation. That is what the contaminated water and the irradiated air and the leaking reactor have been doing to the biology of every organism living inside Springfield's geographic footprint, the animals too. Santa's little helper, the Simpson family dog, has the same bulging eyes as his owners, the same proportional deviations from real canine anatomy. Blinky the fish has 3 eyes. The luminous rats in the plant's basement glow in the dark. The show tells you directly, through Blinky, what the radiation is doing to living organisms in the water near the plant. It gives you a clear cause and effect relationship. Nuclear contamination produces biological mutation. And then it expects you to believe that this process, so clearly established in the show's own canon, somehow stops at the water's edge and does not affect the humans drinking from the same source. The theory says it does not stop. The theory says it has never stopped. The theory says Springfield has been a slow-motion biological experiment for 3 decades, and the evidence has been sitting in the background of every episode, in the yellow faces and the four-fingered hands and the recovery rates that no human body should be capable of. Burns knows. Here's the part of the theory that shifts the whole thing from environmental tragedy into something more deliberate. Burns knows what he is doing. The show makes this explicit across multiple episodes. Burns funds private medical research. He has personal physicians. He undergoes the weekly treatments we discussed, treatments intensive enough that they keep him alive through what amounts to chronic radiation poisoning. Burns has spent more time in proximity to nuclear material than any other character in the show, and he is the only character who has clearly, actively worked to manage the biological consequences of that proximity. He understands radiation better than anyone in Springfield because he is personally dependent on understanding it. He knows what prolonged nuclear exposure does to biological systems because he is managing exactly those effects in his own body, week by week, treatment by treatment, under the supervision of a medical team that the rest of Springfield could never afford to consult. He knows what is happening to the town. He knows what his plant is doing to the water, to the fish, to the people who drink that water and eat those fish and breathe the air that sits downwind of those cracked cooling towers. He knows. And he has chosen, across decades of operational decisions, not to stop it. Because the population of Springfield, cognitively compromised by decades of contamination, serves Burns's interests in a way that a healthy, clear-thinking population would not. Consider Homer's continued employment. The show has given us the mechanism here directly. When German investors briefly purchased the plant, the first thing they did was fire Homer. He was clearly and obviously unqualified for his role. The second thing they did was assess the cost of bringing the facility up to code, and the estimate nearly bankrupted them. So they sold the plant back to Burns. Burns bought it back and immediately rehired Homer. A competent safety inspector would shut the plant down. A competent safety inspector would document the violations, report them to the relevant authorities, and either force remediation or force closure. Homer ensures neither of those things happens. Homer's incompetence is not a workplace annoyance to Burns. It is a structural necessity. The violations continue. The waste keeps leaking. The water stays contaminated. The people of Springfield stay just impaired enough not to ask the questions that would threaten everything. And Burns maintains his monopoly over the town's power supply, its economy, and by extension, its entire population. A population that, the theory argues, has been slowly, steadily, systematically kept from thinking clearly by the same facility that lights their homes and keeps their refrigerators running. The crayon and what it means. Season 12 of the show contains an episode that the contamination theory uses as its most devastating piece of evidence. Homer has a crayon removed from his brain. A physical object, a child's crayon, that had been lodged inside his skull since childhood, pressing against his neural tissue, physically reducing his cognitive function in measurable ways for his entire life. With the crayon removed, Homer's IQ climbs to genius level. He becomes articulate, perceptive, and capable of understanding the world around him with a clarity he has never had before. He can do math. He can follow arguments. He can see the systems that surround him and understand how they work. He can see Springfield for what it really is, and it makes him miserable. Because seeing Springfield clearly means understanding what his job actually is, what the plant is actually doing, what the man who signs his checks has actually been responsible for all these years. Seeing clearly in Springfield is not a gift. It is a burden that the rest of the town is structurally incapable of sharing. So Homer has the crayon put back. He chooses to be as he was. He chooses the fog. But the theory does not spend too much time on Homer's choice. The theory spends its time on the prior question, the one the show raises and then walks away from without answering. How does a crayon end up lodged in a child's brain without anyone noticing? Homer went through his entire childhood, his entire adolescence, his entire adult life in Springfield, visiting doctors, getting checkups from medical professionals in the town where he was born and raised. Not one of them found a foreign object in his skull. Not one scan, not one examination, not one routine check revealed what was sitting there, pressing against his neurons, keeping him from thinking clearly. Either every doctor in Springfield is catastrophically incompetent, or someone knew the crayon was there and chose, for reasons of their own, not to remove it. If the medical establishment in Springfield is compromised, if the physicians in this town are looking the other way while their patients' cognitive function deteriorates from radiation damage and physical brain injury alike, then Homer's crayon is not an accident. It is a detail the show is using to say something it cannot say in plain dialogue. The people of Springfield have something wrong with their brains. Something that keeps them from asking the most basic question available to them as they look up at those cracked cooling towers every single day of their lives. Why are we all like this? The answer, the contamination theory argues, is sitting in that cracked cooling tower. It has always been sitting there, and the plant has made very sure that the people downwind of it are never quite capable of figuring that out. The dome. In the Simpsons movie, the show stops implying and starts stating, Springfield's environmental contamination reaches a point so severe, so far beyond what can be quietly managed or conveniently ignored, that the Environmental Protection Agency, a real federal regulatory agency, operating within the show's own universe, determines that the town must be physically sealed under a massive glass dome to prevent its pollution from spreading to the rest of the country. Think about what that means. Not metaphorically, not as a visual gag. Think about what the show is actually depicting. The United States federal government looked at Springfield and concluded that the entire town was so contaminated, so toxic, so fundamentally dangerous that the only appropriate response was to enclose it entirely. To build a physical barrier between Springfield and the rest of America, to treat the town the way you treat a biohazard, the way you treat a spill site, the way you treat something that has gone so wrong that containment is the only option left on the table. Springfield was classified as an environmental hazard by the federal government, and every resident of the town, every person who has spent years drinking the water, breathing the air, living within the shadow of those cooling towers, was inside the dome when it went up. The contamination theory does not need to speculate after the movie. The movie tells you, Springfield is a contamination zone. The federal government said so. The only question the theory leaves unanswered is one of timing. How long has this been true? How many years before a federal agency took action was the contamination already doing what the theory says it has always been doing? 36 years of the show's run suggests the answer is, from the beginning. From the first moment the plant went online, from the first cracked cooling tower, from the first barrel of waste rolled into the river, from the first luminous rat in the basement, Springfield has been the dome all along. The EPA just finally made it visible. If you're still with me, drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if this kind of deep dive is what you're here for, go ahead and subscribe. There is a lot more Springfield left to explore tonight. Section 2. The Homer Coma Theory. Now we take everything we just established, the contamination, the cognitive impairment, the town that cannot remember its own disasters, and we hold it up against a different theory entirely. A theory that does not contradict the contamination framework. A theory that might, depending on how you choose to read it, exist inside the contamination framework, nested within it like a story within a story. The Homer Coma Theory. And to understand why this theory has become the single most discussed, most debated, most internally consistent fan theory in the history of The Simpsons, we need to go back to a specific night, a specific episode, a specific moment when the show quietly, almost accidentally, handed its audience the key to understanding everything that came after. The 1st of April 1993, the night it happened. Season 4, Episode 18. The title was So It's Come to This, a Simpsons clip show. The premise was straightforward. Bart plays a series of escalating April Fool's pranks on Homer, each one bigger and more elaborate than the last. The escalation peaks when Bart takes one of Homer's beer cans to an auto body shop and places it inside an industrial paint shaker. He shakes it until the pressure inside is catastrophic. When Homer opens the can, the explosion sends him to the hospital. He lies in a hospital bed recovering. He sees a vending machine across the room. He wants a candy bar. He tries to get it. The machine tips over and crushes him. Homer Simpson flatlines. He enters a coma. The episode tells you this directly. It is not a dream sequence or a cutaway joke. It is presented as a canonical event. Homer Simpson is clinically unconscious, and he stays that way for 7 weeks of story time. Then the episode ends with Homer waking up. Bart tearfully confesses at his bedside that the whole thing was his fault. his voice cracking with guilt, and Homer springs awake and immediately begins strangling his son. The family laughs. Everything returns to normal. The show continues. Except, in the final moments of that same episode, the show tells you something that it treats as a throwaway gag, but which the theory treats as the most important piece of information in the entire series. Homer lost 5% of his brain function during the coma. Permanently. Gone. Not recoverable. 5% of his brain. Dead. Because of the oxygen deprivation and trauma of those 7 weeks. And Homer's response to being told this, to being informed that he has suffered permanent and irreversible brain damage, is to laugh. He says he does not understand why he is laughing. The family finds this charming. Nobody finds it alarming. The episode ends. The show continues for 32 more years, and the theory asks a question that nobody in Springfield ever asks. What if Homer never actually woke up? The basic premise. The coma theory was originally proposed on Reddit, attributed to a user called Hard Topic a Name, and it is disarmingly simple once you hear it. Homer did not wake up from his coma in April of 1993. Every episode that has aired since that date is a dream being generated by the unconscious mind of a man lying in a hospital bed in Springfield General, slowly losing brain function as his body fails, and his family sits beside him, waiting for his eyes to open. Everything since Season 4, Episode 18. The celebrity appearances, the trips to space, the encounters with historical figures, the secret societies, the multiple visits from God, the hundreds of jobs, the dozens of countries, the plot lines that could not happen in any realistic version of the world, all of it is a coma dream constructed by Homer's damaged brain from the material of his last conscious memories and whatever ambient stimuli leak through to him from the hospital room around his bed. The show becomes, under this reading, not a 36-year comedy about an American family. It becomes a 32-year dream being dreamed by a dying man, one whose grip on consciousness is loosening with every season, one whose brain is generating increasingly elaborate and impossible stories, because that is what dying brains do when they are trying, desperately, to hold on to something. The evidence, before and after. The most powerful argument for the coma theory is tonal, and it is something that even casual fans of the show have noticed without necessarily naming. Before the coma, The Simpsons was a grounded show, not realistic in the way that prestige drama is realistic. It was always a cartoon, always willing to exaggerate for comedic effect. But the storylines were rooted in recognizable human experience. Homer tries to quit drinking, Marge struggles with feelings of inadequacy, Lisa develops a crush on a substitute teacher, Bart faces the possibility of being held back a year, the family deals with financial strain, the marriage goes through genuine periods of tension. These are stories about things that happen to real families, told through the lens of satire and animation, but emotionally grounded in the texture of ordinary life. After the coma, the shift is not subtle. It is dramatic enough that the internet has been arguing about it for decades. Homer goes to space. Burns captures the Loch Ness Monster. Homer discovers his mother is a fugitive radical. Homer joins a secret society. Homer meets God twice. Homer becomes a professional boxer, a food critic, a country music star, a missionary, a union leader, an astronaut, a voice actor, a bodyguard, a farmer, a sailor, a snowplow operator, and a debatable number of other occupations depending on how you count the episode, where he briefly works every job in Springfield simultaneously. The escalation is so dramatic, the departure from grounded storytelling so complete, that fans coined the term Flanderization to describe what happened to the characters after a certain point, the way their personalities became exaggerated parodies of what they had originally been, losing the subtle contradictions and human complications that made them feel real. The coma theory says, Flanderization is not a writing failure. It is a symptom. It is what happens when a brain generates characters from memory rather than observation. Homer's unconscious mind cannot replicate the nuanced, contradictory people his family actually are. It can only work from its last clear impressions of them, and as time passes and the brain degrades, those impressions become less precise, more exaggerated, more like caricatures of the people they represent. Homer's dream doesn't deteriorate in quality. It deteriorates in realism. And that deterioration tracks, the theory argues, with precisely the decline in grounded storytelling that fans have been complaining about since the mid-1990s. God said something. Here is the detail that makes the coma theory feel less like fan speculation and more like something the show may have actually intended. 6 months before the coma episode, in the season 4 premiere, Homer has a conversation with God, a face-to-face conversation depicted literally within the show. And during that conversation, God tells Homer something. God tells Homer that he will learn the meaning of life. But not yet. God says Homer's time is coming. 6 months later, Homer is in a coma. The theory reads this as a prophecy delivered in plain sight. God told Homer that his time was nearly up, that there was more to come, but that the coming was imminent. And 6 months later, Homer's conscious life ended. What the show presents as a quirky theological comedy gag reads, under the theory, as a narrative announcement. The show was telling you that something fundamental was about to change, that the version of Homer you had been watching for 4 seasons was approaching its conclusion. And then Homer opened a beer can and a vending machine fell on him, and the show kept going, but nothing was ever quite the same. Why? Nobody ages. Every theory about The Simpsons eventually has to account for the aging problem, because it is the most obvious and persistent anomaly in the show's entire run. Bart Simpson was 10 years old when the show debuted. He is 10 years old now. Lisa was 8 then. She is 8 now. Homer and Marge have not gained a wrinkle between them across 36 years of episodes and storylines and cultural changes and real-world events. Maggie has been 1 year old for longer than most people watching the show have been alive. The standard industry explanation is the floating timeline. Long-running animated shows use this device. The present is always the present. Characters do not age because aging would eventually require ending the show, and the show does not want to end. The contamination theory has its own answer. Mutated biology has altered the character's cellular aging process in ways that science within the show cannot fully account for. But the coma theory has the simplest answer. The one that requires no additional explanation, no special pleading, no appeal to radiation science or biological mutation. Nobody ages because they exist inside the frozen mind of a man who went to sleep in April 1993. Of course, his children do not age. His unconscious brain cannot imagine them growing up because he was not there to see it happen. His wife does not age because the last time he saw her, she looked exactly as she does in the dream. His friends do not change because his memories of them are fixed at the moment the vending machine fell and the lights went out. Homer's coma dream preserves his world exactly as it existed on the last day he was conscious, because that is what happens in a coma. The world does not stop, but your experience of the world stops, locked at the last moment of awareness, unable to update, unable to receive new information. Homer's mind is running on the last save file it made before the crash, and that file is dated the 1st of April 1993. Every episode since then is the same file running, cycling through variations, generating new stories from the same limited data set, and incapable of allowing the characters to age, because aging requires new experiences, and new experiences require consciousness, and Homer is not conscious. He is dreaming. The celebrity absorption, one of the coma theory's most elegant explanations, covers something that even fans who do not know the theory have noticed: the explosion of celebrity guest appearances in later seasons. Early Simpsons had guest characters, but the volume and frequency of celebrity appearances in later seasons is dramatically higher than it was in the show's first 4 seasons. Famous musicians, politicians, athletes, actors, cultural figures of every description cycle through Springfield with a regularity that would be strange in any realistic account of small-town American life. The coma theory's explanation is medical and almost touching. Homer is lying in a hospital bed. The room around him has a television. People come to visit and talk near his bed. The hospital has a PA system. The world continues to move and make noise around his body while his mind is locked inside the dream. His brain, in a comatose state, does not lose access to external stimulation entirely. It processes the sounds around it. It registers voices, names, fragments of conversation, and broadcast media, and it incorporates those fragments into the dream the way dreams always incorporate external stimuli incompletely, impressionistically, transforming a voice heard through fog into a character who walks through the doors of Moe's Tavern. Every celebrity who appears in Springfield after April 1993 is, under this reading, a voice that Homer's sleeping brain caught from the television in his hospital room, a name Marge mentioned to someone visiting his bedside, a fragment of music or dialogue or news broadcast that leaked through to the dream and was transformed, by the strange alchemy of unconscious cognition, into a guest character. Homer is not imagining famous people visiting his town. He is absorbing ambient media and weaving it into the only narrative his brain knows how to tell: the story of his family on Evergreen Terrace in Springfield forever. The show's own response. This theory is not unknown to the people who make The Simpsons. The writers are aware of it. They have been aware of it for years. In season 34, an episode called Lisa the Boy Scout included what was described as a deliberately leaked fake deleted scene. In the scene, Homer wakes up from a long coma. The implication is clear. Every outlandish episode since season 4 was just a dream. The scene was animated, voiced, and produced as a complete sequence. Then the show told the audience it was a hoax. The scene was planted by hackers, the narrative went. It was not real. Homer is not in a coma, but think about what the show actually did there. It animated the coma theory's conclusion. It showed it to the audience. It made it visible, specific, undeniable for a moment. And then it pulled back and said, no, it is a joke. It was never real. Do not take it seriously. Executive producer Al Jean addressed the theory directly in 2015 and dismissed it as fan speculation. But what Al Jean did not do is explain why no one ages. He did not explain the tonal shift after season 4. He did not explain why God told Homer his time was coming 6 months before the coma. He did not explain why the show has become progressively more surreal and detached from reality across decades of episodes, in a pattern that maps precisely onto what you would expect from a brain generating increasingly degraded dream content. He said it is not true. The fans did not move on, because the theory does something no official explanation has ever managed to do. It makes all of it make sense. The aging freeze, the tonal shift, the celebrity flood, the reset button that erases consequences between episodes. Homer surviving things that should kill him, the increasingly impossible plots, all of it explained by one premise. Homer's body is in a hospital bed, and his mind is in Springfield. His mind cannot kill him because his mind is the one telling the story. What it means. If the coma theory is true, then the emotional core of The Simpsons is not comedy. It is something sadder and more beautiful than comedy. Homer's deepest wish, the wish that his unconscious mind returns to again and again across 32 years of dreaming, is not complicated. It is not ambitious. It does not require wealth or fame or any of the hundreds of improbable adventures the dream sends him on. He wants his family. He wants Marge to love him. He wants Bart to be his mischievous, exasperating little boy. He wants Lisa to play her saxophone in the corner of the living room. He wants Maggie to be small enough to hold. He wants Friday night at the Simpsons house to last forever. And in the coma, it does. The dream gives Homer everything he wants. His family preserved exactly as he remembered them on the day everything went dark. His children never growing up, because growing up means leaving, and leaving means the family breaks apart. And Homer cannot allow the family to break apart because it is the only thing he is dreaming about. His wife never leaving, because Marge is the center of everything. The person whose presence makes every episode of the dream survivable, no matter what impossible thing happens in it. Homer's coma is not a nightmare. Under the theory, it is the only heaven a man like Homer Simpson would ever ask for. A house on Evergreen Terrace where the kids are always young and the beer is always cold and nobody ever has to say goodbye. And every time Homer survives something impossible, every time the world resets at the end of an episode, every time the credits roll and Springfield is back to normal, and everything catastrophic that just happened has been quietly, completely undone. It is not lazy writing. It is Homer's brain refusing to let the story end. Because if the story ends, if the dream stops running, if the simulation finally crashes and the lights come back on, then Homer has to wake up. And waking up means finding out how much time has passed. How old Bart really is now. Whether Marge waited, whether anyone is still sitting by the bed, whether the family he has been dreaming about for 32 years is still there, or whether they have, as families eventually must, moved on. Or there is the other option, the one the theory holds quietly and does not press too hard. Homer doesn't wake up. The show continues forever, the dream running on whatever power remains in a brain that has been in the dark since 1993, and somewhere in Springfield General, in a room with a television and a vending machine and a window that nobody ever looks through in the episodes, a man is lying very still, dreaming about his family, because they're the only thing worth dreaming about. Section 3. Who really shot Mr. Burns? Let us talk about the greatest mystery in the history of The Simpsons. Not one of the great mysteries, not a contender. The greatest. The one the show built an entire summer of national conversation around in 1995. The one that Fox promoted like a real criminal case. The one that America's Most Wanted covered in a tie-in special. The one that generated a nationwide contest and a promise from the show's creators that the answer was hidden in the evidence, waiting to be found by a sharp enough eye. Who shot Mr. Burns? Now, before we go further, yes, the show told you it was Maggie. Season 7, Episode 1, case closed, baby did it, everyone go home, except the case was never really closed. Because the evidence does not add up the way the show wants you to think it does. And the more carefully you look at every piece of that evidence, the more you start to wonder whether the official answer is the right one, or whether it is simply the convenient one. Let us go back to the beginning, all the way back. How we got here. Season 6, Episode 25. Who shot Mr. Burns? Part 1. This was the summer of 1995. The Simpsons was at the absolute peak of its cultural influence, a show that had already transformed American comedy and American family television, and now wanted to do something that no animated series had ever attempted. A genuine, carefully constructed murder mystery. A whodunit with real clues and real red herrings, and a promise to the audience that the answer was knowable from the evidence presented. The setup is meticulous. Burns, already a villain of impressive depth across 6 seasons, goes too far. He steals oil that was rightfully discovered by Springfield Elementary, gutting the school's budget in one stroke. He shuts down Moe's Tavern by financially destroying the only establishment that serves as a community gathering space for a significant portion of Springfield's adult population. He creates a sinkhole that collapses the Springfield retirement castle. He injures Santa's little helper, the Simpson family dog, leaving the animal in need of expensive medical care. He arranges for Smithers to fire him on the spot when Smithers voices the mildest possible objection to what Burns is doing. And for his finale, his capstone achievement, his crowning act of malevolence against the community he has spent decades exploiting, he builds a device, a massive mechanical disc, and uses it to block out the sun over Springfield. Not figuratively. Burns steals the sun from Springfield. He positions the disc to intercept the sunlight before it can reach the town, plunging the community into permanent artificial twilight so that every resident who wants artificial light will have no choice but to purchase their electricity from the one facility in town that produces it, his facility. By the end of Part 1, the show has taken the time to establish specific, documented, emotionally grounded motives for essentially every named character in Springfield. Homer, because Burns could not recall his name despite Homer working for him for years, a slight that had built from mild humiliation into a genuine source of psychological pain across multiple episodes. Bart and Lisa, because the school lost its oil money. Grandpa Simpson, because the retirement home he lived in was destroyed. Groundskeeper Willie, because his job disappeared along with the school's budget. Tito Puente, because Burns cut the music program that employed him. Moe, because his bar went under. Even Smithers, freshly fired and spending the evening drinking in quantities that the episode makes clear, will affect his reliability as a witness. The entire town gathered at a public meeting to confront Burns. Multiple characters were shown holding weapons. The tension in the episode was extraordinary. The culmination of a season's worth of escalating villainy paying off in a moment where the show seemed genuinely willing to do something permanent. Then Burns collapsed. A single gunshot wound? He staggered to the town sundial and fell, his hands landing on 2 letters, W and S. Or, from Burns's perspective, inverted, M and S. The ambulance took him. The screen went dark. America waited 3 months. The answer the show gave. When Part 2 aired in September 1995, the investigation played out like a comedic procedural. Chief Wiggum and his department stumbled through the case with their characteristic incompetence. Smithers confessed almost immediately, but his confession collapsed under examination. He had been blackout drunk during the time of the shooting and had actually shot a different person entirely. Old Jasper and his wooden leg, nowhere near Burns, at a completely different location. Suspects were eliminated one by one. Principal Skinner had an alibi. Moe had an alibi. Tito Puente provided the single greatest alibi in the history of television. A full musical number in which he explained that he had channeled his rage into composing and performing a samba about wanting to hurt Burns, which meant he had been on a stage in front of a crowd at the time of the shooting. The investigation stalled until police found an eyelash on Burns's suit. DNA analysis traced the eyelash to a Simpson. Homer's fingerprints were found on the gun. Homer had the most clearly established motive in the whole town: the accumulation of years of being forgotten, of having his name ignored by his own employer, reaching a breaking point. Homer was arrested. He was about to be convicted. Then, Burns woke up. Burns looked around the hospital room, took in his surroundings, and identified his shooter, Maggie, baby Maggie Simpson. According to Burns's account, he encountered Maggie in the parking lot after the town meeting. He attempted to take her lollipop. In the ensuing struggle, his gun fell from his holster. Maggie picked it up. The gun discharged. Burns was shot. Case closed. Maggie did it. The investigation ended. Nobody went to prison because, as Chief Wiggum noted, no jury in the world would convict a baby. Except maybe in Texas. The contest, nobody won. Here is the first hole in the official answer, and it is a large one. Fox ran a national contest alongside the episode. Viewers were invited to submit their guesses for the shooter. The prize was significant. The winner would be animated into a future episode of the show. Thousands of entries were submitted. According to the DVD commentary for the episode, provided by the people who actually made it, not a single person from the randomly selected sample of contest entries correctly identified the shooter. Not one. The person awarded the prize did not have the right answer. They were selected randomly from the pool and given a cash payment instead of the promised appearance in the show because they could not be animated as the winner of something they did not actually solve. The writers also noted in the commentary that they were aware of a single person who had posted the correct answer to a Simpsons newsgroup online on the night of the original broadcast. One person. But this person was using a college internet account that had been deactivated by the time the contest ended. The producers tried to find them. They could not. They even included an open invitation on the DVD release for this person to come forward. As far as anyone knows, they never did. Sit with that for a moment. The show's creators designed a mystery that they publicly promised was solvable from the evidence presented in Part 1. They ran a national contest. They offered a significant prize. And when the answer was revealed, essentially the entire participating audience had not solved it. Either the clues were not actually sufficient to reach the correct answer through logic, the red herrings were overwhelmingly more convincing than the real trail, or the answer did not follow from the evidence in the clear, inevitable way the show claimed it did. Any one of those possibilities should give us pause. What Burns actually said, here is the detail that should disqualify the sundial as evidence, and has, inexplicably, been largely passed over in the 30 years of discussion about this mystery. Burns's hands landed on the letters W and S on the sundial when he fell. Inverted from his perspective, M and S. The show presents this as the key clue, the central piece of evidence pointing toward Maggie Simpson. But Burns himself, when he was conscious and able to speak, stated that the positioning of his hands on the sundial was not intentional. He did not deliberately arrange himself to point at his attacker's initials. He fell. He happened to land that way. The central clue in the most famous mystery in the show's history was, by the victim's own testimony, a coincidence. If the sundial clue is meaningless, and Burns said it was, then the evidence case for Maggie essentially rests on Burns's own testimony, identifying her after waking from a coma with a bullet wound to his body, and on DNA evidence that placed a Simpson at the scene. A coma. Burns was unconscious for an extended period after being shot. His memories of the immediate events leading up to being shot were his last pre-trauma memories. The reliability of that testimony, from a man whose age makes him somewhere north of 100 years old, who had just spent an extended period clinically unconscious, is not something the show ever asks anyone to examine. The gun was already missing. Here is the detail that points the finger somewhere other than Maggie, or at least somewhere other than the parking lot scenario Burns described. Shortly before the shooting, Burns's gun holster was shown empty on screen. The gun was missing from his person before the attack happened. This means that whoever shot Burns used his own weapon. And it means they had access to that weapon before the confrontation that Burns described in the parking lot. Burns's account places the gun falling from the holster during a struggle over a lollipop. But if the holster was already empty when the shooting happened, the gun was already gone before any such struggle occurred. The shooter already had the gun. This changes the profile of the likely shooter considerably. The shooting was not necessarily an impulsive act by someone who stumbled across a weapon by accident. Someone had Burns's gun. Someone had obtained it, or found it, or taken it from the holster at some point before the confrontation. Burns's last words before being shot were, according to the show, "Oh, it's you." He recognized his attacker, not with fear, not with alarm, with something that sounds like recognition. The way you might greet someone familiar who has shown up somewhere unexpected. Not "who are you" or "what do you want," but "it's you. I know you." The question the theory has to ask is whether Mr. Burns knows Maggie Simpson well enough to greet her that way, whether they have any prior relationship that would make her appearance familiar rather than alarming. The show does not establish a meaningful relationship between Burns and Maggie before this episode. Burns barely remembers Homer, a man who has worked for him for years. The idea that he would respond to a 1-year-old baby with calm recognition, as though greeting someone whose presence made a certain kind of sense, requires the theory to work harder than it perhaps should have to. Homer's confession. In season 18, Homer Simpson claims, on camera, with witnesses present, that he was actually the one who shot Mr. Burns. He just says it, and nobody reacts, nobody investigates, nobody reopens the case. The richest man in Springfield was shot, and Homer confesses to the crime in a public setting, and the show treats it like a throwaway line and moves on. Either Homer is lying for attention, which is entirely within his character and consistent with his psychological profile, or the original verdict was wrong, and Homer said it out loud because somewhere in the fog of his cognitive limitations, he knows it was him. If Homer did it, if the DNA evidence was misinterpreted, or the investigation was deliberately redirected, then Maggie was not the shooter. She was the cover story. A convenient fall guy who happened to be in the right place at the right time, who could never be prosecuted, who could never be made to deny the accusation under oath because she cannot form sentences. A baby is the perfect scapegoat. She cannot testify to her own innocence. She cannot explain where she was. She cannot produce an alibi or challenge the evidence against her. And she is, as Wiggum noted, immune from prosecution. If someone with knowledge of how Springfield's institutions work, someone with an interest in directing the investigation away from a specific real suspect, wanted to close the case cleanly, there is no neater solution than Maggie. The Marge theory. One of the most compelling alternate theories, developed in detail by fans over the years, makes a case for Marge Simpson as the real shooter. The case is worth taking seriously. Marge watched Burns destroy her children's school. She watched him injure her family's dog. She watched him steal the sun from the town where her children live, creating a situation where no plant could grow, no garden could survive, no child could play outside in natural light. She watched him fire Smithers for the mildest objection imaginable. She watched him systematically dismantle every institution that gave Springfield's residents dignity and community and comfort. Marge has a breaking point. The show has depicted it across multiple episodes. She is patient beyond what most people could manage, but she is not infinitely patient, and she is not passive when the people she loves are threatened. The theory also relies on an earlier episode, Marge Gets a Job, in which Burns developed a significant infatuation with Marge. He pursued her with the kind of obsessive determination that the show played for laughs but established as genuine. If Burns was shot by Marge, why would he not identify her? Because he was protecting her. He took a bullet, woke up in a hospital bed, and had the choice of naming the woman he had once been infatuated with, or pointing at the sundial and letting the town reach whatever conclusion it reached. He chose the sundial. He let the investigation run its course. And when it eventually landed on Maggie, with Wiggum announcing that no jury would convict a baby, the case closed without Burns ever having to say out loud what he knew. It is a theory that requires Burns to have a human motivation, a protective instinct towards someone he cared about, which is not impossible. The show has depicted Burns with genuine emotional responses across its run, buried under decades of villainy but never entirely extinguished. The alternate endings. The show's own creators, the evidence that sits most uncomfortably with the official answer, produced not one but multiple complete alternative conclusions to the mystery. A full alternate ending was animated in which Smithers is revealed as the shooter. Fully voiced, fully produced, a complete version of Part 2 with a different answer. This ending was shown in a clip show episode and dismissed by the host as something that would not have made sense because it would have required ignoring the DNA evidence. And that would be, in the host's words, downright nutty. Clack. The host then acknowledges that ignoring DNA evidence does happen in real life, in a direct reference to a famous criminal case from around the same time. The show winks at you here. It tells you that the official answer is the one that required the least narrative disruption. It tells you that the DNA evidence pointed to a Simpson, the easiest conclusion was reached, and the case was closed. It does not tell you the case was solved. It tells you the case was closed. Those are different things. An early draft of the script had Barney Gumble as the shooter. The writers considered this seriously enough to develop it before abandoning it. The answer was not locked in before the clues were written. The clues were adjusted to fit whatever answer the writers eventually chose. The mystery was reverse engineered, which means the evidence in Part 1 was not designed to lead inevitably to Maggie. It was designed to lead to whoever the writers decided to use. And the writers went through at least 3 different answers before landing on the baby. The final shot, the final image of Who Shot Mr. Burns Part 2 is this. Everyone has left the hospital room. Burns has identified his shooter. The case is closed. The family is heading home. And Maggie Simpson is left alone in the room, just for a moment, in the silence after the adults have gone. She looks around, carefully, deliberately. She confirms that she is alone. Then she moves her pacifier in a slow, deliberate motion that mimics the act of pulling a trigger. The show presents this as confirmation. Maggie knows what she did. Maggie is reenacting the crime, privately, in the moment when no one can see her. But the theory offers a different reading. Babies mimic what they see. It is one of the primary mechanisms of infant learning. Maggie, wherever she was and whatever she witnessed that night, saw someone fire a gun. She watched someone pull a trigger. And she is doing what babies do with things they observe. She is imitating it, processing it through the repetitive replay that infant cognition uses to integrate new experiences. Maggie is not confessing. Maggie is remembering. She saw the shooter. She is replaying what she saw. And if she could tell us who that was, if she could form the sentence and say the name, everything about the official answer might look very different. The case was closed in 1995. 30 years later, it has never quite felt solved. Section 4. Mr. Burns and the Immortality Engine. How is Mr. Burns still alive? This is not a rhetorical question. This is not an invitation to invoke cartoon logic or to say that it is just a show and none of it needs to make internal sense. Within the established canon of The Simpsons, within the rules the show has set for its own universe, Charles Montgomery Burns is a medical impossibility. And the show knows it. The show has spent 36 seasons providing the audience with precisely enough information to understand that Burns should be dead, has been dying for decades, and is kept alive by something that the show never quite looks at directly. Let us look at it directly. The age problem. Burns's age has been stated, implied, contradicted, and restated across dozens of episodes, and every version of the timeline places his birth somewhere in the late 1800s. He has referenced personal memories of events from before the turn of the 20th century. He has told stories about the early 1910s as lived experience rather than history. He has described professional relationships with historical figures who died before the oldest living audience member was born. He has referenced the Gilded Age not as something he studied, but as something he lived through. By the most conservative reading of the show's continuity, Burns is well over 100 years old. By a more liberal reading of the contradictions the show has accumulated across 3 decades, he might be pushing 140. And he does not merely exist. He functions. He runs a multi-billion-dollar corporation with enough operational complexity to require a full administrative staff. He manipulates municipal and regional politics with a strategic sophistication that requires long-term planning and an understanding of how power actually works across institutional systems. He orchestrates schemes against individual residents of Springfield that require him to maintain detailed knowledge of their personal circumstances, their motivations, their vulnerabilities. His body is frail. The show makes this explicit. His physical strength is almost non-existent. He can be toppled by a stiff breeze. He requires Smithers' assistance for tasks that a healthy adult could manage without difficulty. But his mind is sharp. Burns is arguably the most intelligent character in Springfield, operating with a strategic clarity and a ruthlessness that no other character in the show approaches. And he has been operating at that level, with that quality of cognition, for longer than any human being should be capable of sustained consciousness. Three Stooges Syndrome. The most famous scene in Burns's medical history is also the most revealing. Burns visits a doctor. The doctor examines him and delivers the verdict. Burns has every disease known to medical science. Every single one. Simultaneously. The doctor's explanation is extraordinary. All of Burns's diseases are present in his body at the same time, but they exist in a state of perfect equilibrium. Each disease is attempting to progress and kill him. Each disease is being blocked by every other disease also attempting to progress and kill him. None of them can advance because they are all advancing simultaneously, creating a biological gridlock that prevents any single illness from gaining dominance. The doctor calls this Three Stooges Syndrome, comparing it to three people all trying to walk through a doorway at the same time. None of them get through. The practical conclusion is that Burns is the sickest man in America and also, functionally, indestructible, because everything that should kill him is being neutralized by everything else that should also kill him. The scene is played for laughs. It is one of the most quoted scenes in the entire series. But the contamination theory and the broader immortality framework takes it seriously. Burns's body is not maintaining this perfect disease equilibrium through any natural biological process. The show does not establish a mechanism by which a body could naturally arrive at this state and sustain it indefinitely. The theory argues that the weekly radiation treatments are the mechanism. The treatments do not cure Burns's diseases. They manage them. They keep every illness in perfect controlled stasis, balanced against every other illness, preventing any single condition from gaining enough ground to break through the gridlock and become fatal. It is not medicine in any conventional sense. It is nuclear maintenance. Burns's body is a reactor. The diseases are reactions happening inside it. And the weekly treatments are the functional equivalent of adjusting control rods, dampening the reactions to prevent a runaway meltdown. Miss one treatment, and the balance collapses. The control rods come out. Every disease surges forward simultaneously, and the reactor goes critical. Burns dies. Smithers as life support. Waylon Smithers occupies a role in Burns's life that the show frames as devoted assistant, loyal companion, unrequited love story, and comic foil depending on which episode you are watching. All of those readings are valid. But the immortality theory adds a fourth role that the show has established in detail without ever naming it directly. Smithers is Burns's life support system. Smithers manages Burns's schedule with the obsessive precision of someone who understands that missing an appointment is not an inconvenience but a death sentence. Smithers monitors Burns's physical condition with a vigilance that the show sometimes plays as excessive devotion, but which, under the theory, is simply the necessary attention of someone who knows exactly what happens if he looks away for too long. Smithers ensures Burns reaches every weekly treatment session. The show has established repeatedly that if Smithers were ever removed from his position, Burns would be helpless. Not emotionally helpless in the way that someone might be lost without a long-term assistant. Physically helpless, unable to manage the treatment schedule that keeps him alive. Unable to navigate the complex logistical requirements of his own continued existence. Without Smithers managing the appointments, Burns misses a dose. Without a dose, the disease equilibrium breaks. Without the equilibrium, every illness in his body advances at once. Smithers is not devoted to Burns out of love alone, though the show has established that love, or something that functions like it, is present. Smithers is devoted because he carries the knowledge that his absence, for long enough, is a death sentence for the man he serves. That knowledge is the foundation of their entire relationship, not the professional hierarchy, not the emotional dynamic, the medical necessity. Smithers stays because Smithers knows what happens if he doesn't, the historical record. The show has given Burns an almost absurd connection to American historical events, and the pattern is worth examining as a whole rather than as individual comedic gags. He attended Yale, establishing his presence in elite American society from early in the 20th century. He served in World War II, in a role the show describes as morally ambiguous at best. During that service, he obtained a $1 trillion bill from the United States government and kept it hidden for decades, establishing a pattern of acquiring and concealing assets that has characterized his entire life. He has described personal relationships with Howard Hughes. He has referenced the Gilded Age as lived experience. He has personal memories of events that span from the 1890s to the present day, a range of roughly 130 years of continuous, functional memory. This is not the memory of a man who has lived a normal human lifespan. This is the memory of a man who has been alive and operational, in full possession of his cognitive faculties, for longer than the country he lives in has been a major industrial power. The theory builds on this to examine the Burns family as a dynasty rather than just an individual. The show has depicted the Burns family as one of the oldest, continuously wealthy lineages in American history. They did not merely accumulate wealth. They accumulated the kind of structural wealth that predates the institutions that would normally regulate it. The kind of wealth that builds infrastructure and then charges everyone else to use it. The kind of wealth that exists so far above normal legal accountability that the concept of being held responsible for your actions becomes theoretical rather than practical. Burns did not build this empire. He inherited it and has been maintaining and extending it for his entire impossibly long life. Which raises a question the show never answers. Is Burns unique in the family's history? Or have previous members of the Burns dynasty employed similar strategies to extend their hold on power and their grip on life past normal human limits? Before nuclear radiation, before modern pharmaceutical intervention, before any of the technology that currently keeps Burns alive and functional, what did earlier members of the Burns family use? The show does not say, but it establishes that the dynasty has been in continuous control of its accumulated wealth for longer than most American institutions have existed. That kind of continuity across generations does not happen through normal succession. It requires extraordinary measures or extraordinary luck, and the show has never suggested that the Burns family relies on luck. The relationship between Burns and death. Burns has come closer to dying than almost any other character in Springfield's history, which is saying something in a show where one minor character dies and comes back dozens of times. He was shot. He has been hospitalized through a range of causes across dozens of episodes. He has collapsed, fallen, been attacked, been poisoned, been left in the wilderness without resources, been exposed to conditions that would have ended most people before the commercial break. Every single time, he comes back. But the mechanism of his return is different from every other character in the show. Homer survives because the show needs Homer to survive. Homer's indestructibility is passive, a cartoon convention granted by the narrative because he is the protagonist, and the protagonist cannot die. Burns comes back through infrastructure, through money, through the machinery of wealth that ensures that no matter what happens to his physical form, there will always be someone standing by, with the equipment, the medication, the expertise, and the financial resources to rebuild him. He has spent a century constructing a system specifically designed to ensure his survival, regardless of what happens to his body. Every institution he has corrupted, every politician he has owned, every doctor he has retained, every private medical research program he has funded, it all serves the same purpose. Keep Burns alive, keep the balance, keep the reactor running. Burns's immortality is not passive. It is the most elaborate, active project of his entire life. He is not surviving despite his age. He is surviving because of everything he has spent his age building. The difference matters. Homer will be in Springfield forever because the show needs him. Burns will be in Springfield forever because Burns will not allow himself not to be. Springfield needs Burns. Here is the most unsettling aspect of the Burns immortality framework, and it is one the show has built the case for without ever saying it out loud. Springfield cannot survive without Burns. The town's economy is built around the power plant. The power plant is built around Burns. Burns is built around the weekly treatments. The treatments require the infrastructure that Burns's wealth provides. It is a closed loop, a self-sustaining system in which the man, the machine, and the money feed each other in a cycle that has no natural endpoint. Springfield could theoretically challenge Burns, could theoretically demand accountability for the contamination, the violations, the three-eyed fish, the dome, all of it. But challenging Burns would mean challenging the economic foundation of the entire town. And without that foundation, Springfield has no employer, no power, no economic structure that would allow it to continue as a functioning community. So the town does not challenge Burns. The town has never challenged Burns. The town cannot challenge Burns because challenging Burns means the lights go out, the jobs disappear, the economy collapses, and Springfield dies. And a dead Springfield is worse, at least in the town's collective calculation, than a Springfield that is slowly poisoned by a cracked reactor and an ancient billionaire who won't stay dead. Burns is the oldest man in Springfield. He is kept alive by weekly radiation treatments, sustained by wealth that predates the nation itself, protected by an assistant whose devotion is functionally a medical requirement, and surrounded by a population too cognitively impaired by his facility's contamination to fully understand why any of this is happening. He is not immortal. He is something more specific than immortal. He is too expensive to die, and Springfield will keep paying the bill for as long as Burns keeps the lights on, which, if his treatment schedule holds, will be forever. Section 5. The Skinner Incident and the Machinery of Forgetting. Season 9, Episode 2. The Principal and the Pauper. The 28th of September, 1997. This episode is consistently ranked among the worst in the series. It has been called the moment The Simpsons stopped caring about its own continuity. It has been cited for almost 30 years as the point where the writers betrayed the audience's trust by retroactively destroying a character the audience had come to care about. The theory we are about to discuss says the fans have been reading this episode backwards. It was not a mistake. It was a revelation. And once you understand what it actually shows you, every continuity error in the show's history, every episode that ends with catastrophic events forgotten by the next week, every disaster that Springfield experiences and then collectively moves past without consequence, it all stops looking like lazy writing and starts looking like evidence. What happened? Springfield Elementary holds an event honoring Principal Seymour Skinner's 20 years of service. During the celebration, a stranger walks in. Nobody recognizes him. He introduces himself as Sergeant Seymour Skinner. The real Seymour Skinner, a decorated Vietnam War veteran who was captured as a prisoner of war in Southeast Asia, believed dead by everyone who knew him, and who has, after years of captivity and an escape of his own making, finally come home. Come home to discover that someone else has been living his life. The man Springfield has known as Seymour Skinner for 20 years is an imposter. His real name is Armin Tamzarian. Before Vietnam, he was a petty criminal from the wrong side of the tracks, drafted into the army, assigned to the same unit as the real Skinner. When Skinner was captured and presumed killed, Tamzarian felt guilty. He traveled to Springfield to tell Skinner's mother, Agnes, the news. But Agnes assumed he was her son. She needed him to be her son. And Tamzarian, a man who had never been wanted or claimed by anyone, who had never had a family or an identity worth keeping, let her believe it. He became Seymour Skinner. He took the name, the rank, the life, the mother, the career, the dynamic with Bart that would define 20 years of episodes, and he sustained the fiction for 2 decades until the real Skinner walked through the door and the whole thing came apart. What Springfield did about it? The town held a meeting. The real Seymour Skinner was present. Tamzarian was present. The truth was fully exposed and understood by everyone in the room. And then Springfield voted. Not on whether to prosecute Tamzarian for identity fraud, not on how to restore the real Skinner's identity and compensate him for 20 years of having his life stolen, not on any question that a community with a functioning relationship to truth and justice would have voted on. Springfield voted on whether to acknowledge the truth at all. The verdict was unanimous. They chose the lie. Judge Snyder issued a legal decree declaring that Armin Tamzarian was, legally and permanently, the real Seymour Skinner. The actual Seymour Skinner, the war hero, the man who survived a prisoner of war camp in Southeast Asia and walked across the Pacific to find his life waiting for him, was tied to a railroad car and physically expelled from Springfield. And the judge made it explicitly illegal to mention the truth ever again, under penalty of torture. Let that settle. A judge in a court. issued a formal legal decree making it a crime, with specific stated punishment, to speak the factual truth about the identity of a public official in their community. And the entire town went along with it, unanimously. Without apparent distress, the real Skinner was sent away. The fake Skinner returned to work. And by the next episode, it was as though none of it had ever happened. Why fans hated it? The fan response to this episode was fierce enough that it has never fully subsided. Harry Shearer, who voices Skinner among several other characters, publicly expressed displeasure with the storyline. Critics argued that the episode destroyed Skinner's character by revealing that everything established about him was fiction. His military service, his relationship with Agnes, his history with Bart, his entire psychological profile, all of it built on a stolen identity, none of it real. The criticism is understandable. The episode does retroactively reframe a character the audience had spent 9 seasons understanding and relating to. But the theory makes a different argument. The theory says the episode did not destroy Skinner. The episode diagnosed Springfield. It showed you, explicitly and without disguise, the mechanism by which the town maintains its impossible reality. Springfield has always operated this way. The town has always chosen comfortable fictions over uncomfortable truths. The town has always agreed collectively to forget whatever does not fit the agreed-upon narrative. The town has always expelled anyone who insists on saying what is actually true when the truth threatens the stability of the established story. The principal and the pauper is the one time the show let you watch the vote happen. The systematic amnesia of Springfield. Think about how many times Springfield has experienced events that should permanently alter the town's reality. The town has been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times across the show's run. It has been invaded. It has been sealed under a dome by the federal government of the United States. It has survived nuclear near misses. It has experienced environmental catastrophes of sufficient severity to prompt federal intervention. It has had documented encounters with what appeared to be extraterrestrial life. It has had the sun literally blocked from its sky by a mechanical device operated by a local billionaire. After every single one of these events, everything is back to normal by the next episode. Nobody references the dome. Nobody mentions the near meltdown. Nobody brings up the time the sun went away. The slate is wiped. The catastrophe dissolves. Springfield resets to its baseline with a thoroughness that is almost eerie when you look at it across the span of seasons rather than episode by episode. The standard explanation is episodic storytelling. Long-running shows do not carry consequences from one episode to the next because doing so would create narrative complexity that limits the show's ability to tell standalone stories. The coma theory explains it as a dreaming brain resetting between sleep cycles. The contamination theory explains it as the cognitive damage from chronic neural impairment manifesting as collective memory failure. But the principal and the pauper offers something neither of those theories offers: a direct, witnessed, in-story explanation. Springfield resets because the town votes to reset, collectively, deliberately, through an unspoken social contract that says, we do not acknowledge what happened, we maintain the agreed-upon version of reality, we treat the lie as truth, and anyone who breaks this contract is removed from the community. That is not a cartoon convention. That is a community survival mechanism. The logic of collective denial? Consider the alternative. What would happen if Springfield actually did acknowledge its own history? If they remembered the dome, they would have to acknowledge the pollution that caused it. If they acknowledged the pollution, they would have to address the power plant that produced it. If they addressed the power plant, they would have to confront Burns. If they confronted Burns, the economy that everyone in the town depends on would either collapse or be forced into a confrontation that Burns, with his resources and his institutional control, would almost certainly win. And if they challenged Burns and lost, the consequences for every person in Springfield who participated in the challenge would be severe. The calculation is not complicated. The cost of remembering is higher than the cost of forgetting, so they forget. Not because the contamination has impaired their memory beyond recovery, though the theory holds that it has contributed to this. Not because Homer's coma dream is resetting their narrative between cycles, though the theory allows for this reading, but because Springfield has looked at its own situation and made a rational, if deeply troubling, choice. Forgetting is safer than remembering. The real Seymour Skinner was not expelled from Springfield because the town was malicious. He was expelled because he was threatening. He arrived with proof that the official narrative was false, and in Springfield, proof that the official narrative is false is the most dangerous thing a person can carry. Because if the narrative of Principal Skinner is false, then the question of what else is false becomes possible to ask. And that question, followed to its logical conclusions, leads to the power plant, and to Burns, and to the three-eyed fish, and to every catastrophe the town has ever voted to forget. The real Skinner was not an inconvenience. He was a canary. And Springfield responded to the canary the way systems always respond to things that tell them something is wrong. They removed it from the environment, and they made sure no one would be bringing another one. What it means for everything else. Once you understand the mechanism, the principle, and the popper reveals, every continuity error in the show's history stops being an error. Homer forgetting that Bart nearly destroyed his marriage last season is not a writing oversight. It is Springfield functioning as designed. Marge not referencing the time the town was sealed under glass is not the writers losing track of continuity. It is the community's collective denial doing what it does. The characters do not have amnesia in the clinical sense. They have something more specific, a trained, cultural, socially enforced incapacity for acknowledging anything that would require them to fundamentally question the system they live inside. Springfield does not forget because its residents are unable to remember. Springfield forgets because remembering is too dangerous. The Principal and the Pauper is not the worst episode of The Simpsons. It is the most important episode because it is the only episode that shows you the infrastructure underneath everything else, the machinery that makes every reset possible. The social contract that allows a town of contaminated, cognitively impaired, indefinitely young residents to continue living inside a story that should have collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions decades ago. The contract holds because everyone in Springfield has signed it, not in ink, in silence. And the penalty for breaking it is a railroad car out of town. Section 6. Maggie Simpson, the silent architect. Maggie Simpson does not talk. She does not walk reliably. She communicates primarily through pacifier sounds and the occasional pointed stare that contains, if you are paying attention, more information than most of the verbal communication that surrounds it. She is 1 year old. She has been 1 year old for 36 years, and in that time, in that frozen year of infancy sustained across 3.5 decades of episodes, without saying a single word that counts as established canon, she has accomplished more than every other member of her family combined. She shot a billionaire. She led a rebellion against a tyrannical daycare operator. She saved her family from dangers that the adults around her did not see coming. She demonstrated problem-solving abilities that would be remarkable in a trained adult. She was tested and found to possess intelligence that the standardized instruments available could not fully measure. Through all of it, every remarkable thing she has ever done, she has maintained her silence. Not because she cannot speak. The theory argues she chooses not to. The shooting, reconsidered. We discussed the Burns shooting in detail in an earlier section, and the question of whether Maggie actually pulled the trigger remains genuinely open. But whether she did or not, the aftermath of the official verdict is worth examining on its own terms. A 1-year-old baby was identified as the person who shot the richest man in Springfield. The police investigated. The evidence was examined. The official conclusion was that yes, this infant committed an act of violence against a powerful adult, and there is nothing to be done about it because you cannot prosecute a baby. And that was the end of it. But then there is the final shot of the episode. The room has emptied. Everyone has left. Maggie is alone, for just a moment, in the silence after the adults have gone. She looks around, carefully, with a deliberateness that is not the unfocused gaze of an infant, but the measured check of someone making sure they are not observed. Then she moves her pacifier in a motion that mimics pulling a trigger. We spent time in the earlier section considering whether this is a confession or an imitation, but here is what both interpretations agree on. That motion requires things that infants are not supposed to have. It requires situational awareness. She checked the room. She registered that she was alone before she made the gesture. She understood that the gesture, in the context of the events just concluded, was something that should not be performed in front of witnesses. It requires memory. She is referencing something that happened. She is replaying it. It requires caution. She waited. These are not reflexive behaviors. These are the behaviors of someone who understands context, who understands consequences, who has decided that discretion is the appropriate strategy. A 1-year-old who understands the concept of a private moment is not a normal 1-year-old. The Longest Daycare. In 2012, the show released a 7-minute theatrical short called The Longest Daycare, screened in cinemas before an Ice Age film. It was nominated for an Academy Award. And it is, in some ways, the most revealing 7 minutes in the entire Simpsons canon when it comes to understanding Maggie. The premise is simple. Maggie is dropped off at the Ayn Rand School for Tots, a daycare facility run with authoritarian precision. Inside, Maggie encounters a caterpillar that is preparing to become a butterfly. She wants to protect it. Another baby, a bully who has appeared in earlier episodes as Maggie's nemesis, wants to destroy it. What follows is a miniature film in which Maggie outmaneuvers the bully, the daycare staff, and the facility's physical security systems to protect the caterpillar and release it into the open air. She does this without saying a word. She does it through observation. She reads the environment of the facility and identifies every constraint, every checkpoint, every obstacle between her and her goal. She identifies the bully's patterns and models his likely behavior. She develops a strategy that requires multiple steps executed in a specific sequence. She improvises when circumstances change. She adapts when an approach fails and moves to a backup plan without hesitation. Her body can barely keep up with her mind. She falls. She stumbles. She crawls when running would be more efficient. Every physical limitation that comes with being a 1-year-old is fully present in the short. But her decision-making is flawless. Every choice is correct. Every move is optimal given the constraints of her situation. She is operating at a cognitive level that her physical development cannot support. She is thinking faster, more clearly, and more strategically than her body can express. And she succeeds. The butterfly is released. Maggie watches it go. The short never asks you to explain how a 1-year-old can do this. It just shows you that she can, and trusts you to sit with the question of what that means. What Lisa's story tells you about Maggie's choice. To understand why Maggie stays silent, the theory asks you to look at what happened to the last intelligent woman in this family who did not. Lisa Simpson is brilliant. She is a genuine child prodigy, a musician and a thinker, and an ethical reasoner of real depth. Her IQ is substantially above anyone else in her household and most of the adults in Springfield. She sees through the town's collective fictions with a clarity that nobody else in her immediate environment approaches. And what has all of that intelligence bought her? Isolation, loneliness, mockery from her peers, dismissal from her teachers, and a permanent position as the person in the room who says the true thing that everyone else ignores. Lisa speaks up and is ignored. Lisa challenges authority and is punished for it. Lisa tries to improve the world around her and finds the world around her completely indifferent to improvement. Her intelligence is her defining characteristic and her heaviest burden because she cannot stop using it visibly. She wears it on the outside. She announces herself as the person who sees things clearly. And Springfield, which has made a social contract out of not seeing things clearly, responds to that announcement with consistent and practiced indifference. Maggie has watched this happen since the day she was born. She has been sitting in the corner of the room for 36 years, watching her sister fight every day for recognition and receive nothing but resistance. Watching the smartest person in the family be consistently overlooked, undervalued, and dismissed by a household and a community that has built its entire survival strategy around the principle that the truth is more dangerous than the lie. And Maggie learned something from watching this. Silence is power. Invisibility is armor. The less they notice you, the more you can accomplish. Every time Maggie does something remarkable, the family does not notice. Every heroic act, every display of intelligence, every moment where Maggie quietly solves a problem that the adults around her cannot even perceive clearly, it happens below the radar. In the margins, in the spaces where no one is paying close attention because babies are not considered worth paying close attention to, Maggie has secured herself the most effective disguise available in Springfield. She pretends to be exactly what everyone expects a 1-year-old to be: passive, dependent, helpless, pre-verbal. She is none of those things. She may be the opposite of all of them. The intelligence tests. The show has tested Maggie's intelligence directly on multiple occasions. The results vary across episodes. The floating timeline and the show's relaxed relationship with continuity means these tests do not stack cleanly, but the pattern they establish is consistent. Maggie is not a normal baby. Every time the show puts her intelligence under any kind of measurement or observation, the result is anomalous, off the charts, beyond what standardized instruments can meaningfully capture. The show plays these moments as quick jokes and moves on. But the accumulation of them across the series establishes something that cannot be dismissed as a one-time gag. This baby is consistently, reliably, measurably extraordinary in her cognitive capacity. And nobody in her family has yet fully reckoned with this. Homer does not notice because Homer does not have the cognitive capacity to notice. Marge does not notice because Marge's attention is occupied with managing Homer and Bart and Lisa and the household. Bart does not notice because Bart's attention is occupied with himself. Lisa, who might notice, is too absorbed in her own internal world of ideas and frustrations to spend much observational energy on the baby sister, who appears to be doing ordinary baby things. Maggie observes all of them. None of them observe her. This is, the theory argues, precisely the situation Maggie has designed. Mutation and its directions. The contamination theory established that Springfield's radiation exposure creates biological mutations in the people who live inside the contamination zone. It argued that those mutations account for the yellow skin, the physical abnormalities, the recovery rates, the cognitive impairments, but mutation does not move only in one direction. Radiation damage to biological systems can reduce capacity. It can also, in certain configurations, amplify capacity. Mutation is not the same as damage, though damage can produce mutation. Sometimes mutation produces something that functions better, in specific ways, than the original would have. The theory holds that Homer and Maggie represent two ends of a spectrum that the same environmental cause produced. Homer's exposure, prolonged and direct, combined with the physical brain damage of the crayon, reduced his cognitive function to the point where the show's creator assigned him an IQ of 55. The contamination hit Homer and took something essential away. Maggie's exposure from the same environment, through the same water and air, produced the opposite result. Her mutation did not reduce. It amplified. Whatever the radiation did to the specific neural architecture that was developing in Maggie during gestation and infancy, it did not impair. It enhanced. Homer and Maggie are the same experiment run twice, producing completely different outcomes. Two sides of the same radioactive coin. He is what happens when mutation diminishes. She is what happens when mutation gives something that should not be possible. The coma reading. If the coma theory is true, if every episode since April 1993 is being generated by Homer's unconscious mind, then Maggie's extraordinary intelligence takes on a meaning that the theory finds almost unbearably poignant. Homer cannot see Maggie grow up. He cannot watch her develop from the infant she was on the day he went into the coma, into whatever extraordinary person she would have become. He cannot hear her speak. He cannot know who she is becoming. So in the dream, he makes her something that does not need to become. He makes her extraordinary already, complete already, capable beyond any infant should be capable, safe in her own intelligence in a way that means she does not need him to protect her. Because Homer's deepest fear, underneath all the comedy and the cartoon physics and the impossible adventures the dream sends him on, is that he is not enough, that he cannot protect his family, that they are not safe without him. Maggie's genius is Homer's answer to that fear. He cannot be there for her, so he dreams her into someone who does not need him to be there. He gives her capabilities so far beyond what the adults around her possess that even without her father conscious and present, she will be okay. Her intelligence, under the coma theory, is not a mutation. It is a prayer, a father's unconscious gift to the child he cannot reach. What she is waiting for. The show has never definitively answered what Maggie is going to do with everything she is. She has been watching for 36 years. She has been storing information, assessing the adults around her, modeling the systems that govern Springfield with an analytical clarity that nobody else in her environment approaches. She knows about burns, through whatever she absorbed in the parking lot on the night of the shooting, and through 3 decades of observation since. She knows about the power plant. She knows about the contamination in whatever form her infant mind has processed it. She knows about the deal between Grandpa and Burns, the one that guaranteed Homer's employment. She knows about everything that has ever happened within her field of observation. She has not acted on most of it. She is waiting. For what? The show does not say. The show has never definitively revealed what Maggie's endgame is, because Maggie is the only character whose future remains genuinely unknown. Every other member of the Simpson family has been given at least a glimpse forward, a flash-forward episode, or a stated trajectory. Maggie has not. She is 1 year old. She has been 1 year old for 36 years. Behind that pacifier, behind those enormous eyes that see everything, behind 3 decades of deliberate and strategic silence, something is thinking. Something is planning. Something has been watching and waiting and accumulating information with the patience that only someone who knows they have extraordinary capability can afford to exercise. And when Maggie finally decides to act, when she finally breaks her silence, Springfield will not see it coming. Nobody will, because that is exactly how she designed it. Section 7. The predictions. Let us talk about the phenomenon that made The Simpsons more culturally prominent in the 2020s than it was during any point in its actual run. The predictions. The idea that a cartoon show that premiered in 1989, staffed by writers working from their understanding of the world as it existed in any given production year, has been accurately forecasting major world events for 3 decades. The idea that somewhere in the nearly 800 episodes of the show's run is a blueprint for events that had not yet happened when the episodes were written, encoded in jokes and throwaway visual gags and background details that nobody noticed at the time and everyone notices now. The internet has built an entire parallel mythology around this idea. Every year or two, a new screenshot circulates. A new prediction is discovered, and the cycle of amazement and shared disbelief begins again. The truth behind this phenomenon is more interesting than the conspiracy theory version and more interesting than the simple debunking version, and we are going to work through it carefully. The big ones. The headline case, the one that started the mainstream conversation about the show's predictive capacity, is the Trump presidency. In the year 2000, an episode called Bart to the Future depicted a future in which Lisa Simpson has become the first female president of the United States. The episode is about Lisa's presidency, but in describing the political situation she is inheriting, a character refers to her predecessor in the Oval Office as Donald Trump. The episode does not show Trump. It names him as the president. The episode aired 16 years before Donald Trump won the 2016 presidential election. The internet lost its collective mind in proportion to how unexpected Trump's victory had felt to the people who had not seen it coming. Here was a cartoon show, they said, that had told them this was going to happen in 2000, 16 years. How did they know? The screenshot from that episode has been shared more times than most people can meaningfully count. It became one of the defining images of the post. 2016 cultural moment, shorthand for a specific kind of disorientation. The feeling that reality had become a joke and the joke had been written long ago. But that is not the only one. In a 1995 episode, the show depicted a watch-like device worn on the wrist that functions as a communication and computing tool. Smartwatches as a mainstream consumer product were still 20 years away. In a 1994 episode, Homer goes to space alongside a genuine historical astronaut. Commercial space tourism, the idea that civilians could purchase tickets to leave Earth's atmosphere, was a concept that would not materialize as a real industry for decades. In a 1998 episode, Homer's amateur mathematical scribbling appears to include an equation that, interpreted generously, approximates a prediction for the mass of the Higgs boson particle. The Higgs boson was experimentally confirmed at CERN in 2012, 14 years later. In a 1993 episode, a flu originating from Asia spreads to Springfield and creates exactly the kind of public response: the panic buying, the desperate search for treatment, the community division over how to respond, that COVID-19 would produce 27 years later. And in the same episode, the town accidentally releases a swarm of hornets into the community, which felt uncomfortably echoed in 2020 when Asian giant hornets appeared in the American Pacific Northwest while an actual pandemic was running. In 1996, a joke depicted the hip-hop group Cypress Hill accidentally booking the London Symphony Orchestra to perform alongside them at a concert due to some miscommunication while they were under the influence. In 2024, Cypress Hill performed with the London Symphony Orchestra at the Royal Albert Hall. 28 years between the joke and the reality. In 1998, the show depicted the media conglomerate 20th Century Fox being absorbed by an even larger entertainment entity, the sort of acquisition that would represent a seismic consolidation of media power. In 2019, Disney completed its acquisition of 21st Century Fox, giving it control of an enormous portion of American entertainment. The list extends considerably further than this. The official explanation: Al Jean, who has served as executive producer across a significant stretch of the show's run, has addressed the prediction phenomenon more than once. His explanation is blunt and consistent. If you throw enough darts, you will hit some bullseyes. The Simpsons has produced nearly 800 episodes over 36 years. Each episode contains dozens of jokes, satirical observations, background details, visual gags, and throwaway references. Across that volume of content, produced across that span of time, some portion of it will coincidentally align with future events through statistical probability alone. Producer Bill Oakley, who oversaw several of the show's best seasons, made the point even more directly: there are very few cases where the show actually predicted something. The apparent predictions are mainly coincidences, and coincidences accumulate naturally when you have enough content covering enough time. And then there is the specific mechanism that explains the more impressive cases. The writers were not making random guesses. They were observing real trends that were already in motion and following those trends to their logical conclusions. Trump had been publicly floating the possibility of a presidential run since the late 1980s. He was a consistent presence in the cultural conversation about celebrity and political ambition for decades before 2000. The writers of Bart to the Future did not predict Trump's presidency. They looked at a man who had been making noises about running for president for over a decade, at a cultural trajectory that was moving toward the increased prominence of celebrity in political life, and they wrote a joke about where that trajectory ended. The Disney-Fox merger did not come from nowhere. Media consolidation was an accelerating trend throughout the 1990s, visible to anyone paying attention. The joke about a megacorporation absorbing its competitors was not a prophecy. It was a satirical observation about something that was already happening, pushed one step further. The smartwatch was not a miraculous anticipation of technology that did not exist. The concept of computing power shrinking and becoming more personally integrated with the body was a well-established technological trajectory in the mid-1990s. Writing a joke about a wrist-mounted computer was a reasonable extrapolation of where technology was going, not a prediction of a specific product. The Simpsons writing staff has historically been among the most educated in American television, with multiple writers holding degrees from Harvard and Yale and backgrounds in mathematics, computer science, political theory, and a range of other disciplines that equip them to read the present carefully and extrapolate it intelligently. They are not prophets. They are extremely attentive readers of the culture they live inside, pushing what they observe to its absurd but logical conclusions. What debunking misses? The official explanation covers the majority of the prediction phenomenon, but it does not cover all of it. Some of the coincidences are specific in ways that make statistical probability feel like an insufficient explanation. The Trump episode did not merely suggest that a celebrity might run for president and win. It specified Trump by name. It included visual imagery that mirrors the aesthetic of his actual campaign announcement, the specific detail of an escalator descent, in ways that go beyond general trend observation. The Siegfried and Roy episode did not merely joke about dangerous exotic animals in entertainment. It depicted a specific white tiger attacking one of two specific Germanic performers, and that is almost exactly what happened in 2003 when Roy Horn was critically injured by one of the white tigers in the act he shared with his partner. These details are different from "we observed that technology was getting smaller" or "we noticed that Trump kept talking about running for office." These are specific images that aligned with specific subsequent events in ways that resist easy probabilistic dismissal. Which brings us to the more interesting theoretical framework. The show shapes the future. The Simpsons does not predict the future. The Simpsons shapes the future, not through magic, not through any mysterious foreknowledge, through the specific mechanism of cultural saturation and the way that saturation works on the imagination of a society that has spent 36 years watching this show. The Simpsons is one of the most watched, most quoted, most referenced pieces of American media in history. It has been running for longer than most of its current audience has been alive. Its vocabulary has become part of the American lexicon. Its observations have become part of the way Americans understand their own culture and their own history. When the show makes a joke about Trump becoming president in 2000, that joke does not disappear into the archive. It circulates, it gets referenced. It becomes part of the cultural background radiation, the low-level hum of shared knowledge and shared reference points that informs how Americans think about what is possible and what is inevitable. The joke does not predict the Trump presidency. The joke makes the Trump presidency feel familiar. It primes the cultural imagination. It takes an idea and puts it into the water supply of American popular consciousness, where it sits for 16 years, not directing anyone's specific actions, but normalizing the concept, making it feel like something that was always coming rather than something that arrived from nowhere. When the actual event happens, the response is not, "This has never been imagined before." The response is, "We've seen this before. The Simpsons already did this." That is not prediction. That is cultural pre-processing. The show did not predict the Disney-Fox merger. The show made media consolidation feel like the punchline of a joke that everyone already knew, so when the merger was announced, the cultural response was not shock but recognition. Of course they did. The Simpsons already told us this was where it was going. Springfield does not reflect America. At this point in the show's history, after 36 years of continuous cultural saturation, the relationship has inverted. America has become Springfield. Confirmation bias and the archive. Here is the piece of the prediction phenomenon that is almost never discussed, but is absolutely essential to understanding it correctly. The Simpsons has made thousands of jokes that did not come true. Jokes about jetpacks, which are still not a mainstream consumer product. Jokes about moon colonies. Jokes about specific political outcomes that went in the opposite direction. Jokes about social trends that never materialized. Jokes about technologies that seemed inevitable in 1997 and still have not arrived. Nobody shares those clips. Nobody creates viral screenshots of the Simpsons jokes that turned out to be wrong. Nobody builds conspiracy theories about the predictions that failed. Confirmation bias does not work in reverse. We remember the hits and we forget the misses with a consistency that is itself almost perfectly regular. The internet functions as a kind of highlight reel machine, surfacing examples that confirm a narrative and allowing the contradicting examples to sink back into the archive. Across nearly 800 episodes, if even 5% of the satirical observations the show has made align with future events through the combination of perceptive trend reading and statistical probability, that 5% is more than enough material to construct a convincing case for prophetic ability. The other 95% is invisible. The Simpsons did not write the future. It wrote so many possible futures across such a long period of time that some of them were mathematically certain to arrive. And the internet, with its powerful filtering mechanism, ensures that only those arrived futures become cultural reference points. That said, even knowing how the trick works, even understanding the confirmation bias and the volume effect and the trend extrapolation, some of those coincidences remain striking. Some of them make you sit back and stare at the screen for a moment longer than the statistical explanation quite accounts for. And maybe that is the real value of the prediction phenomenon, not the conspiracy theory version and not the pure dismissal version, but the honest version, which is, this show has been paying extraordinarily close attention to American culture for 36 years, and extraordinarily close attention occasionally produces results that feel like more than attention. The writers know something, not the future, but something about the present that most people are not looking at carefully enough. And when you look at the present that carefully for long enough, some portion of what you see becomes true. Section 8. Mona Simpson and the Conspiracy That Made Homer. For the first 6 seasons of The Simpsons, Homer's mother was dead. That was the official story. Abe Simpson, Homer's father, told him that his mother had died when Homer was young. He showed Homer a grave. Homer grieved, in the way that Homer grieves things, which is imperfectly and incompletely and in ways that shape his behavior without his ever fully understanding why. He grew up believing he was a boy whose mother had left the world before he could really know her. That belief became the scaffolding of Homer's entire personality. his desperate and sometimes suffocating need to be loved by the people around him, his clinginess toward Marge, the fear that sits just under the surface of every episode where their relationship is strained, his terror of abandonment, which the show depicts as comedy but which the theory reads as something much more serious, his willingness to endure humiliation, abuse, and neglect from his employer rather than risk losing the one stable thing in his life, his compulsive need to be liked, to be included, to matter to the people in his immediate environment. Homer Simpson's entire personality is a coping mechanism for a loss that was not what it appeared to be. In Season 7, the show pulled back the curtain. Mother Simpson, the episode aired the 19th of November, 1995, and is considered by many fans to be one of the greatest episodes the show has ever produced. Here is what happens. Homer fakes his own death to avoid working on a Saturday. He pushes a dressed dummy off a cliff near the power plant. The town believes he is dead. When Marge insists he go to the Hall of Records and correct the death certificate, Homer makes a discovery that changes his life. According to municipal records, his mother is alive. She never died. The grave Abe showed him, the one over which Homer grieved for his entire childhood, was not his mother's grave. It was the resting place of Walt Whitman, the poet. Abe Simpson had been pointing his son at a famous American writer's headstone for decades and calling it his wife's burial site. Homer finds Mona at a cemetery, visiting a grave she believes belongs to her son. She does not recognize him at first. He has grown into someone she could not have predicted from the child she last held while he was sleeping. But when Homer proves who he is, the reunion that follows is one of the most genuinely emotional scenes in the show's history. A grown man and the mother who vanished from his life when he was 6 years old, finding each other beside a headstone that belongs to neither of them. Then Mona tells him why. What really happened? The story goes back to 1969. Mona Simpson was an ordinary woman, married to Abe, mother of a young boy named Homer, living an unremarkable life in Springfield while the world outside was burning through the civil rights movement, the counterculture, the protests against an ongoing war. She was radicalized. The show depicts this with its characteristic mixture of absurdity and genuine emotional weight. Mona joined a group of activists, and they targeted a facility owned by Mr. Burns. Not the nuclear power plant. Something else. Something that Burns had been operating in Springfield alongside the power plant in the same community where Homer was growing up, where families were living without any awareness of what was happening in the facility down the road. A biological weapons laboratory. Burns was manufacturing weapons-grade pathogens in Springfield, in a lab designed to produce biological materials of the kind that are typically reserved for military arsenals and classified research programs. Sitting in the same town where children were playing and families were buying groceries, and the local economy was humming along in blissful ignorance. Mona and her group broke into the lab. They destroyed the biological agent stored inside. They did what they had come to do. And then Mona made a mistake. As the group fled, she stopped to help someone who had been knocked down in the chaos of the raid. The person she stopped to help was Mr. Burns. She stopped to help the man whose weapons she had just destroyed. She helped him get up. He saw her face. He saw her clearly, the way that Burns sees everything that might someday be useful to him. He reported her to the FBI. From that moment forward, Mona Simpson was a federal fugitive. She could not go home. She could not contact her family. She could not explain anything to the 6-year-old boy asleep in his bed. She kissed Homer goodbye while he was sleeping and disappeared. Burns's pursuit. Burns did not merely identify Mona to the FBI and move on. He held the grudge actively. When Mona finally returns to Springfield in Season 7's present day, Burns recognizes her almost immediately. He spots her through a taxi window and calls the authorities. The FBI appears at the Simpson house. Mona has to run again. Homer has to say goodbye to his mother for the second time, this time knowing exactly why she is leaving and exactly who forced her out. And knowing that the man who forced her out, the man who has been systematically pursuing a woman through the federal legal apparatus for 27 years because she interrupted his biological weapons program, is his employer. Homer works for Burns. He has worked for Burns for his entire adult life. He earns his paycheck from the same man who stole his mother from him, who drove her underground, who ensured that Homer would grow up believing he was unloved, that his mother had abandoned him, that there was something fundamentally wrong with him that made the people he needed most leave. Homer does not connect the dots. He does not confront Burns. He does not quit. He does not seem to fully process the relationship between the billionaire who controls his working life and the billionaire who dismantled his family. The show plays this as tragedy. Homer's inability to make this connection is not presented as stupidity that can be laughed at. It is presented as the limit of what he can hold in his mind simultaneously, and that limit is itself a consequence of everything the theory has been building toward. The architecture of the damage. Here is the conspiracy that the theory constructs from the material the show has provided. Burns did not accidentally ruin Mona's life. He ruined it deliberately, in retaliation for the raid on his facility, and in doing so, he engineered something much larger than revenge. By driving Mona away when Homer was 6 years old, Burns ensured that Homer would develop the specific psychological profile that made him the ideal employee for the Springfield nuclear power plant. A man who grew up believing his mother left because there was something wrong with him will spend his life trying to earn the love of the authority figures around him. He will tolerate things that a secure person would not tolerate. He will accept treatment that a healthy person would recognize as exploitation, because the alternative, losing the relationship, being abandoned again, is worse than the exploitation itself. Homer's terror of abandonment makes him a perfect employee for an abusive system. He will stay at a job that exposes him to dangerous levels of radiation. He will work through safety violations that a competent person would report. He will fail at his responsibilities in ways that protect Burns's operational secrets. He will do all of this not because he has been told to, but because the only thing he knows is that if he leaves, he loses the one stable structure in his life. Burns broke Homer as a child, and the broken Homer is exactly what Burns needs in Sector 7G, the deal. The show confirms the conspiracy in a later season with a revelation that ties everything together. Burns had committed a crime. Grandpa Simpson discovered it. In exchange for Grandpa's silence, Burns guaranteed that Homer would always have a job at the plant, no matter how many mistakes, no matter how many violations, no matter how many of the show's 742 documented errors in Homer's professional record. Homer would never be permanently fired. This is why Burns bought the plant back from the German investors and immediately rehired Homer, not because Homer is special, not because Burns has any affection for him, because there is a deal, brokered between an old man and the enemy of his family, maintained in silence, never explained to the person whose life it governs. Homer's job security is not a cartoon convenience. It is a contractual obligation, a dark agreement between two men across a generation, at the center of which sits Homer Simpson, who has been working his whole adult life to pay the bills and keep his family fed, and has never once understood that the job he goes to every day is his because his grandfather sold something to the man who destroyed his mother. Mona's death. Mona Simpson dies in a later season. The death scene is one of the show's quietest and most devastating moments. Homer sits beside her. He holds her hand. He watches the mother he barely knew slip away, and the show does not cut away. It does not put a joke here. It lets the weight of everything between them sit in the room. 27 years of absence. The lie about the grave. The 6-year-old boy who woke up and found her gone. The adult man who worked for her persecutor for decades without ever fully understanding the connection. All of it present in the room. And she is gone. The Simpsons is a comedy. It has always been a comedy. But underneath the comedy, underneath the gags and the recoveries and Homer falling down and getting back up, and the whole indestructible machinery of Springfield reset after reset, there is a story about a family that was systematically dismantled by one man's power and one town's inability to resist it. Mona fought and lost everything. Abe made a deal with the man who drove her away and buried the truth for decades. Homer inherited the consequences of both and never had enough cognitive clarity to understand why his life felt the way it felt. And Burns won. Burns always wins. Because in Springfield, the man with the money writes the rules. And the rules say Homer Simpson will work at the nuclear power plant, the one that poisoned his water and irradiated his children and kept his mind just foggy enough to miss the shape of everything that happened to him. Homer was broken before he ever clocked in for his first shift. The crayon was already in his brain. The plant was already poisoning the water. The deal was already done. Burns just had to wait for the broken boy to grow up and come to work. Section 9. Where is Springfield? And what is the floating timeline? Where is Springfield? Not which state is it in? That question has been asked and deflected and contradicted and answered again and contradicted again for the entire run of the show, and the answer has always been more interesting than any specific state could provide. The real question is deeper. The real question is, why has the show spent 36 years making it impossible to answer? Why is the precise location of the most famous fictional town in American history still, after 800 episodes, genuinely unknown? Springfield has oceanfront property. It has mountain ranges. It has desert. It has forests. It has farmland that looks like the Midwest. It has a harbor and a gorge and a tire fire that has been burning since before the show began and apparently continues to burn indefinitely. It borders, depending on which episode you are watching, the states of Ohio, Nevada, Maine, and Kentucky. No real American town has all of these geographic features within driving distance. No real American geography allows you to go from mountains to ocean to desert to Great Plains farmland within the kind of distances the show routinely implies. Springfield does not exist in any single American state because Springfield exists in all of them simultaneously. The creator's answer. Matt Groening, the show's creator, addressed the location question in a 2012 interview. He named Springfield, Oregon, as the inspiration for the town's name. He said he chose it because Springfield is one of the most common city names in America, and because he grew up in the Pacific Northwest near an actual Springfield. For approximately 48 hours, the mystery was solved. Then the show continued to air episodes that place Springfield in geographic contexts inconsistent with Oregon. The writers kept writing contradictions. The interviews did not bind the show. The mystery did not stay solved. Because the mystery was not an accident. It was a design choice. Springfield's geographic impossibility is the show's most sophisticated structural joke, and it is a joke that only becomes visible when you step back far enough to see 36 years of contradictions as a pattern rather than a series of careless errors. The theories applied. Under the contamination theory, Springfield's geographic impossibility is of a piece with everything else the radiation has done to the town. If the contamination can produce three-eyed fish and four-fingered humans, and a man who glows in the dark, and another man who has been alive since before the Spanish-American War, why should the physical landscape itself be exempt? Perhaps the contamination does not merely affect biology. Perhaps it affects the physical space around the plant in ways that compress or distort the geography of the region, creating a zone where the normal rules of American landscape do not apply. It is a stretch. The theory acknowledges this, but it is no larger a stretch than anything else the contamination has been asked to explain. Under the coma theory, Springfield's geographic impossibility is the most natural thing in the world. Homer's dreaming brain does not have a precise, accurate map of the United States in its memory. It has impressions, fragments, emotional associations. Mountains from a family vacation glimpsed from a car window. Ocean from a beach trip or a commercial on the hospital television. Desert from a movie or a news broadcast. Farmland from driving through the interior of the country at some point in Homer's life. Dreams do not respect geographic logic. They have emotional logic. Spatial associations rather than cartographic accuracy. Homer's brain assembled Springfield from every American landscape it had ever encountered and layered them together without regard for whether they could realistically coexist, because in a dream they can. Under the principle and the Popper theory, Springfield's deliberate geographic ambiguity is a legal shield. You cannot hold a facility accountable for environmental violations if the facility's jurisdiction keeps shifting. You cannot bring consistent regulatory oversight to a nuclear plant whose state of operation changes depending on the episode. You cannot establish which attorney general has authority, which EPA regional office is responsible, which state environmental code applies, when the state itself is perpetually undefined. Springfield floats between states because landing means accountability. Landing means a federal agency with a fixed jurisdiction, and an actual mandate shows up and starts asking about the three-eyed fish and the cracked cooling towers, and the man who seems to have been running the facility since before. The Cold War. Geographic uncertainty is not a comedy device. It is a legal strategy. The floating timeline. Now we arrive at the final mystery. The one that sits at the center of everything else, like a still point around which all the other theories orbit. Bart Simpson was 10 years old in 1989. He is 10 years old now. Lisa was 8. She is 8. Homer and Marge were roughly in their mid-30s. They still are. Maggie was 1 year old. She still is. 36 years have passed in the real world. 0 years have passed in Springfield. The industry term for this is the floating timeline. Long-running animated shows use this device to avoid the narrative complications that come with characters aging. The present is always the viewer's present. The technology changes, the cultural references change, the episodes reflect whatever year they were produced in, but the characters do not change. They are locked at the ages they were when the show began, and they will remain locked there for as long as the show continues. Most people accept this. Most people encounter it in passing, register it as a known quirk of the format, and move on. But The Simpsons has been running long enough that the floating timeline has produced contradictions so large and so structurally revealing that they have started to crack the foundation of the show's reality in ways that demand attention. The backstory problem. When the show began, Homer and Marge's history was grounded in the late 1970s and early 1980s. They met in high school. They fell in love. They had their children. The whole timeline of their courtship was set during a specific era, complete with the music and fashion and cultural reference points of that period. This made sense for characters who were supposed to be in their mid-30s at the end of the 1980s. If you are 35 in 1989, you went to high school in the early 1970s. That math works. But the floating timeline has dragged the present forward by 36 years. If Homer and Marge are still in their mid-30s in 2025, they did not go to high school in the early 1970s. They went to high school in approximately 2005, which means their adolescence was not defined by Watergate and disco and the cultural upheaval of the Vietnam era. It was defined by MySpace and early YouTube and flip phones and the early 2000s cultural moment. The show has addressed this not by aging the characters, but by repeatedly rewriting their backstories. Homer and Marge's origin story has been told at least 4 times across the show's run, each version resetting their formative years to a different decade. In one version, they are young people of the 1970s. In another, they are products of the 1990s. In another, their youth is clearly situated in the 2000s. The characters are the same across all of these versions. The love story is the same, but the cultural context of their past changes every time the show needs to reference it. This means Homer and Marge do not have a stable past. They have a past that is continually rewritten to serve the current episode's needs and then discarded when the next episode needs something different. Their memories are not fixed. Their origin story is a draft that the show revises without ceremony whenever the timeline demands it. The people do not change, but the history of the people is constantly being rewritten. What all the theories agree on. Every single theory we have discussed across this entire exploration converges on this point. They arrive here from different directions, using different evidence, applying different frameworks, but they all reach the same conclusion. Time does not work in Springfield. The coma theory says nobody ages because they exist inside the frozen mind of an unconscious man, a dreaming brain that cannot update its models of the people it loves because it has no new information about them, only the last image it captured before the lights went out. The contamination theory says nobody ages because the biological mutation produced by decades of nuclear exposure has altered the cellular aging process in ways that go beyond what science within the show's universe can explain, or even fully observe. The principal and the pauper theory says nobody ages because Springfield collectively, repeatedly, through the social contract of comfortable denial, refuses to acknowledge the passage of time and its consequences. Time passing is an uncomfortable truth. Springfield has made a practice of refusing uncomfortable truths. The Burns immortality theory says that at least one resident of Springfield has found, through wealth and technology and an infrastructure of private medical research, a way to remain indefinitely at a fixed biological state, which means the concept of aging as an inevitable process is already negotiable in Springfield's universe. If Burns can stay alive past any reasonable biological limit through money and intention, the rules about what aging must do to a living organism are demonstrably not absolute. Every theory says the same thing in different language. Something in Springfield has broken the normal mechanism by which time accumulates on living things. The future the show can imagine but won't show. The show has proven it can imagine its characters aging. It has done it multiple times, in flash-forward episodes that glimpse the futures the characters might inhabit if time were allowed to pass. Lisa's Wedding, from Season 6, shows Lisa as a 23-year-old woman engaged to be married. The future it depicts is detailed and emotionally rich. Lisa has become who the show has always suggested she would become. The episode is beautiful and melancholy in equal measure. And then it ends. Lisa returns to being 8 years old. The future closes like a window. The permanent present resumes. The show can imagine growth. It refuses to allow it. And there is something in that refusal, something in the specific choice to glimpse the future and then seal it away, that the theory reads as honest. The show knows what it is doing. It knows that the characters could age, that the stories could develop, that 36 years of episodes could add up to something that resembles the actual passage of a life rather than an endless loop. It knows this, and it chooses the loop, because the loop is not just a production convenience. The loop is the show's thesis. The thesis. The Simpsons is the American family. They have been the American family for longer than any other fictional household in the history of the medium. And the American family, as this show depicts it, cannot be allowed to change. Homer must always be middle-aged. Marge must always be patient. Bart must always be rebellious. Lisa must always be idealistic. Maggie must always be silent and watching and waiting. The dynamic must be preserved. The structure must hold. Because the moment the Simpson family actually ages, the moment Bart goes to college and Lisa moves to a city where her intelligence is valued, and Maggie finally speaks, and Homer retires, and Marge is left in a house that has gone quiet, the show is not a comedy anymore. It is an elegy. It is the story of a family that ran out of time. And America, the theory argues, does not want that story. America wants the version where the kids are always young and the parents are always together and the house always looks the same and nobody ever has to say goodbye. The floating timeline is not a narrative device. It is a mirror. The Simpsons are frozen in time because we need them to be, because they represent something that we, the audience, have decided we cannot afford to let go of. The messy, chaotic, dysfunctional, loving, infuriating, resilient American family, the family that survives everything, recovers from everything, resets after every disaster, and comes back on Sunday night at 8 o'clock as though the world never changed. We built the loop. We maintain it. Every time we watch, every time we laugh, every time we quote a line from an episode that aired before most of us were born, we tighten the loop a little more. We make it a little harder for the Simpsons to leave, because if they leave, if Bart turns 11 and the story has to follow him into adolescence and adulthood and all the things that adulthood requires, then the show ends. And the show ending means admitting that the version of America it represents, the chaotic, resilient, eternally optimistic version of the middle-class American family, was always temporary, always fragile, always one birthday away from dissolving into something we do not recognize anymore. Time stopped in Springfield because we stopped it. We pressed pause in 1989, and we never pressed play. And here we are, 36 years later, watching the same family, in the same house, on the same street, in the same impossible town, waiting for something to change, knowing nothing will, because we will not let it. Section 10. Hans Moleman, Ned Flanders, and the show's final thesis. Before we close, two smaller mysteries that deserve the attention they rarely get. The first is a body count that the show has been quietly accumulating for 3 decades. The second is the darkest interpretation of the nicest man in Springfield, Hans Moleman and the question of death. If you have watched The Simpsons for any length of time, you know Hans Moleman. He is the tiny, elderly, nearly blind man who appears in the background of Springfield scenes and exists, as far as the show is concerned, primarily to suffer. He gets hit by cars, he gets crushed by falling objects, he gets buried alive, he is eaten by animals. He walks into traffic and disappears under wheels. He is struck by lightning, he burns, he falls from heights. He is present in the vicinity of virtually every dangerous event that takes place in Springfield, and he consistently fails to survive these encounters. By conservative estimate, Hans Moleman is the most frequently killed character in the history of American animation. The show has killed him dozens of times. Not in Treehouse of Horror episodes, which exist outside canonical continuity. Not in dream sequences. In regular episodes, in the main story, In the canonical ongoing narrative of Springfield, Mulliman dies. And then he appears in the next episode completely intact, with no explanation, no acknowledgement of his previous death, no in-universe awareness that a man the audience just watched die is standing here buying groceries as though nothing happened. Most fans accept this as a running gag. Mulliman dies a lot. It is funny. Do not think about it. But under the framework we have been developing across this entire exploration, Mulliman's repeated deaths are deeply strange and worth taking seriously. Consider what the contamination theory does with him. If Springfield's nuclear contamination creates biological mutations in the people who live within the contamination zone, if those mutations have altered the fundamental biological processes of the town's residents in ways that produce yellow skin and four-fingered hands and healing rates no human body should be capable of, then Mulliman might represent the most extreme mutation in Springfield's entire population. A man whose cellular biology has been so fundamentally altered by nuclear exposure that it has developed, through whatever bizarre mechanism radiation is capable of triggering in a biological system, the capacity to reconstitute itself after fatal trauma. He does not survive his deaths the way Homer survives injuries. Homer endures damage and heals from it. Mulliman actually dies, his body ceasing to function by any reasonable definition, and then he comes back. Not through cartoon logic exactly, not through the same passive narrative protection that keeps Homer going. Through something biological and specific to whatever the plant has done to him. Death in Springfield, for certain residents, may be a temporary condition rather than a permanent one, a biological reset rather than a terminal event. The number. Mulliman once stated his age as 31 years old. 31. Look at him. He appears to be in his 80s or 90s at minimum. He moves with the gait of a very elderly man. He is nearly blind. He is tiny and fragile, and the world seems constantly on the verge of killing him, which, to be fair, it frequently does. If Mulliman is telling the truth, something aged him catastrophically beyond his years. Something took a man in the early middle of his life and turned him into what he appears to be decades prematurely. Something that also, and this is where the theory gets strange, made him nearly impossible to kill permanently despite his physical frailty. Whatever happened to Mulliman aged his exterior and made his interior indestructible. The contamination theory has an answer for this. The coma theory has an answer. The collective denial theory has an answer. The only framework that struggles to account for it is the one that says The Simpsons is just a cartoon, and Mulliman's age is a mistake, and his repeated deaths are a running gag with no deeper significance. The theories, whatever their other disagreements, all agree. There is no such thing in Springfield as something with no deeper significance. Ned Flanders, the programmed saint. Now let us talk about the character the show has quietly destroyed more thoroughly than any other. And the destruction was quiet precisely because it happened behind the most convincing performance of happiness that Springfield has ever seen. Ned Flanders is everything Homer Simpson is not. He is kind and patient and generous and devoutly religious. He is financially responsible and physically fit and a genuinely devoted father. He is considerate of his neighbors and present in his community and consistent in his values. He is, by any objective measure, a better person than Homer Simpson in essentially every dimension the show has established as meaningful. And the show punishes him for it with a relentlessness that starts as comedy and, under sustained examination, becomes something closer to a thesis statement about how the universe of Springfield actually works. Ned's wife, Maude, was killed at a Springfield Speedway event when a t-shirt cannon misfired. The shirts hit Maude because Homer had been dodging them. Homer's selfishness, his reflexive, unconsidered, entirely characteristic self-preservation directly caused the death of his neighbor's wife. And Ned forgave him. Because that is what Ned does. He forgives. He turns the other cheek. He absorbs everything that the universe and Homer and Springfield throw at him and responds with grace and patience and an unwavering belief that there is a plan, that the suffering serves a purpose, that goodness eventually receives its proper accounting. Except it does not. Not in Springfield. What the hurricane revealed. When a hurricane destroys Ned's house, the community rallies to rebuild it. And the community's effort is so incompetent, so fundamentally disrespectful of quality or craft, or the basic requirements of structural integrity, that the rebuilt house collapses immediately. Ned snaps. In one of the most startling sequences in the show's history, Ned Flanders has a complete psychological breakdown. He screams at the town. He insults every person who has ever wronged him. He says things he has been holding inside for what is clearly a very long time, things that have been accumulating behind the smile and the diddly-do and the endless cheerful forgiveness. And then he is institutionalized. He is committed to a psychiatric facility where it is revealed, in a scene that recontextualizes everything about his character, that Ned's relentless niceness is not natural. It is the product of childhood behavioral modification. Ned was a violent, uncontrollable child. His parents, free-spirited and philosophically opposed to discipline, took him to a psychiatrist who spent years conditioning the aggression out of him through intensive behavioral therapy. He was treated until the violent impulses were suppressed so deeply that they no longer presented as impulses at all. The treatment worked in the sense that Ned stopped being violent. It worked by creating something that is not quite a personality and not quite a performance, but occupies the uncomfortable space between them. Ned's kindness is not character, it is conditioning. His patience with Homer is not saintly, it is pathological. He cannot express anger because the neurological pathway for expressing anger was systematically suppressed before he was old enough to understand what was being done to him. His faith is not spiritual conviction. It is a framework for understanding why a man who does everything right keeps receiving outcomes that suggest the universe does not care whether you do everything right. His forgiveness of Homer after Maude's death is not grace. It is the programmed response of someone whose conditioning will not allow the natural human reaction to surface: God's silence. Here is the detail that makes Ned's situation the most theologically precise joke the show has ever told, though it does not feel like a joke when you see it clearly. God speaks to Homer, literally, directly, face-to-face, multiple times across the show's run. The show depicts Homer having actual conversations with the divine. God gives Homer advice. God warns Homer about the future. God engages with Homer as though Homer's presence is worthy of divine attention. God does not speak to Ned. Ned has dedicated his entire life to faith. He goes to church every Sunday with a consistency that makes the rest of Springfield's intermittent religious attendance look like casual tourism. He has built his entire identity around his relationship with God. He has structured his values, his choices, his responses to suffering, around the belief that God has a plan, and that plan will ultimately make sense. And God talks to Homer. Homer, who sleeps in church. Homer, who breaks essentially every commandment across the show's run, with a casual regularity that suggests he has never fully internalized what a commandment is. Homer, who prays primarily when he needs something and forgets to pray when he does not. Homer, who is about as far from a devout worshiper as a character can be while still living next door to one. God talks to Homer and ignores Ned. The theory reads this not as theological commentary, but as a statement about Springfield's operating system. The system does not reward goodness, it rewards compliance. And Homer is compliant in the specific ways that the system requires, while Ned is good in ways that the system has no mechanism for recognizing or rewarding. The gap that never closes. Homer Simpson and Ned Flanders have lived next door to each other for 36 years. Homer does everything wrong. He is selfish, irresponsible, prone to spectacular failure, and incapable of sustained effort toward any goal that requires delayed gratification. His life should, by any reasonable accounting, be a disaster. His marriage should not have survived. His career should have ended decades ago. His children should be bearing the psychological weight of a father who cannot reliably show up for them. Instead, Homer has a stable marriage to a woman who loves him genuinely. His job is guaranteed by a contract he does not know about. His family survives every crisis and resets to a functional baseline with a consistency that defies the probability of his choices. He is indestructible, beloved by his family despite everything, and completely protected by the system he lives inside. Ned does everything right. He is kind, responsible, disciplined, and deeply committed to his community and his family. By any reasonable accounting, his life should be an example. His marriage should have been long and happy. His children should be thriving. His community should recognize his contribution and reflect it back to him. Instead, his wife is dead because his neighbor dodged a t-shirt. His house collapsed because his community cannot be bothered to do quality work. His faith goes unanswered, while his neighbor chats with God. His goodness is received by Springfield as either irrelevant or mildly irritating. The gap between what each man deserves and what he receives has not moved in 36 years. Because the gap is not there by accident. The gap is structural. The gap is what the system produces. Springfield rewards certain things and ignores others, and goodness is not among the things it rewards. Compliance, dependency, and the incapacity to fundamentally challenge the status quo, those are rewarded. Homer has all three. Ned has none of them. Ned Flanders is the saddest character on The Simpsons. Not Homer, who is too cognitively impaired to fully comprehend the architecture of his own suffering. Not Lisa, who is young enough to retain some belief that things might eventually improve. Not Burns, who is too powerful to experience consequences. Ned, who sees clearly, who feels everything, who has tried his entire life to be good in a system that has no interest in goodness. That is the show's final, quiet, devastating thesis. What it all adds up to. We have spent a long time in Springfield tonight. We have looked at the contamination theory and watched it build a case for environmental catastrophe from the bones of 342 safety violations and a fish with 3 eyes. We have followed the coma theory into the hospital bed in Springfield General and considered what it would mean for every episode since April 1993 to be the dream of a dying man who just wants his family to be okay. We have reopened the Burns shooting case and found enough holes in the official answer that the word closed no longer means quite what it is supposed to mean. We have traced Burns's impossible lifespan to its medical foundations and discovered a self-sustaining system in which the man, the treatments, and the money feed each other in a loop with no natural endpoint. We have watched Springfield vote to criminalize the truth and exile the last honest man in town on a railroad car headed nowhere good. We have sat with Maggie in the quiet of her 36-year silence and tried to imagine what she is thinking, what she has been storing, what she is waiting for the right moment to do with. We have examined the prediction phenomenon and found something more interesting than prophecy, a feedback loop between a show and its culture so long-running and so deeply embedded that the two have become difficult to separate. We have followed Mona Simpson's trail from a Springfield neighborhood in 1969 to a biological weapons lab to a decades-long exile, and we have traced the damage of that trail across 3 generations of a family that never knew the full story of why they were broken. We have looked for Springfield on the map and found it everywhere and nowhere, floating between states with the deliberate evasiveness of something that knows exactly what would happen if it were pinned down. We have stared at the floating timeline until it stared back, until we understood that the loop is not the show's failure but its thesis, not a mistake but a mirror held up to the audience that built it. Every theory in this exploration is different. Every theory uses different evidence and different logic and makes different claims about what The Simpsons is really about. But every theory arrives at the same place. Something is wrong in Springfield. Something fundamental and structural and impossible to fix from inside the system that produced it. Whether it is the radiation or the coma or the collective denial or the engineered dependency or all 4 working in combination, something has broken the normal rules of reality in this town. And the show has been documenting that broken reality quietly and carefully and with extraordinary precision for 36 years. The show is not hiding its mysteries. It is showing them to you every single week. The yellow skin, and the 4 fingers, and the ageless children, and the billionaire who will not die, and the town that will not change. It has been showing you all of it, in plain sight, since the first episode. The only reason any of us missed it is that we have been watching long enough to think we know what we are seeing. We have become Springfield. We have accepted the loop. We have looked at the 3-eyed fish and said, yes, that is just how things are around here, and we have moved on without asking the obvious question. But the theories exist because some people looked at Springfield and could not accept the surface. They dug. They connected. They asked the questions that the characters cannot ask because the characters are trapped inside the story. And what they found is a version of Springfield that is stranger and sadder and more beautiful than anything the show presents at face value. A version where Homer's stupidity is a scar left by a system that broke his family before he was old enough to understand what was being done to him. Where Maggie's silence is the most strategic decision anyone in the family has ever made. Where Burns's immortality is the logical end state of wealth that has been compounding and protecting itself for over a century. where Marge's patience is not submission but the load-bearing wall that keeps the whole structure from collapsing under its own weight, where Bart's rebellion is not dysfunction but the only sane response to a world that has stopped making sense. Where Lisa, 8 years old and brilliant and lonely, keeps raising her hand and asking the question no one wants to answer because she is the only person in Springfield who has not stopped looking for the truth. That is The Simpsons, 36 seasons, nearly 800 episodes, the longest-running animated series in American history, the most analyzed, most theorized, most dissected show ever put on television. And after all of it, after all the theories and all the evidence and all the hours spent trying to understand what is happening in that impossible town, on that impossible map, in that impossible floating present, the biggest mystery is still the simplest one. Why can't we let them go? Maybe because they are us. Maybe because Springfield is our town, built from the pieces of every American community we have ever lived in or passed through or seen on a screen and thought, yes, that is somewhere I recognize. Maybe because Homer is our father, in all the ways that matter and in all the ways that frustrate. Maybe because Marge is the person holding the family together in ways the family does not fully appreciate until much later. Maybe because Bart is who we wanted to be when we were 10 years old, and Lisa is who we suspected we should have been, and Maggie is the version of ourselves we keep hidden, watching everything, saying nothing, waiting for the moment when it will finally be safe to speak. Or maybe it is simpler than that. Maybe we cannot let them go, because letting them go means admitting that 36 years have passed, that we are older now, that the world has changed in ways we did not entirely anticipate and cannot entirely reverse. That the couch we sat on as children, watching the opening credits and hearing that theme song for what felt like the first time every single time, is gone now. In someone else's house or in a landfill or simply not the same couch anymore in the ways that matter. And as long as The Simpsons is on, as long as the loop keeps running, as long as Bart is 10 and Lisa is 8 and Homer is stumbling through the door at 5:30 after another day at the plant and Marge is in the kitchen and Maggie is in the corner watching everything, we do not have to admit any of that. We can sit down, we can turn on the television. We can go home to Evergreen Terrace, to Springfield, to the family that never changes in the town that never ages, in the show that never ends. Thank you for spending this time in Springfield with me. Close your eyes if they are not already closed. Let the town fade slowly, the yellow light of it dimming at the edges. The power plant cooling tower just visible against a sky that is always a little too orange to be quite real. The Simpsons will be there when you wake up. It always is. That is the whole point. Good night. If you made it all the way here, leave a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is. And if this is the kind of deep dive you want more of, subscribe. There are a lot more impossible towns to visit. Section 11. The secondary characters and the world they build. We have spent most of our time tonight with the Simpson family themselves and with the central figures who orbit them most closely. But Springfield is not just the Simpsons. Springfield is an entire community, and the community has its own mysteries, its own buried stories, its own characters whose situations become strange and illuminating when you look at them through the frameworks we have been developing. Some of these secondary characters are worth spending time with tonight because they add texture to the contamination theory, the coma theory, and the broader picture of what Springfield actually is. Each of them, looked at carefully, tells you something about the town that the central characters cannot tell you because the central characters are too close to their own stories. The secondary characters are the town's background, and the background, in Springfield, is where a lot of the real information lives. Chief Clancy Wiggum and the failure that is the system. Chief Wiggum is the head of the Springfield Police Department. This fact alone is alarming when you sit with it, because Wiggum is, within the show's universe, one of the least competent law enforcement officers ever depicted in American comedy. He is lazy, easily bribed, quickly confused, and reliably the last person to understand what is happening in any situation that requires his professional attention. But here is what the theory holds about Wiggum that elevates him from a simple incompetence joke into something more structural. Wiggum is not an accident. Wiggum is the logical product of a system. In Springfield, law enforcement is a function that serves the interests of the people with enough money and institutional influence to shape what law enforcement does and does not notice. Burns has that money and that influence. Burns has, across dozens of episodes, demonstrated a relationship to the legal structures of Springfield that is best described as ownership, not corruption in the sense of individual transactions, though those occur too. Systemic ownership. The kind of relationship to institutional authority that comes from having been the primary economic foundation of a community for long enough that the community's institutions have organized themselves around your continued operation. A genuinely competent police chief in Springfield would be a problem. A genuinely competent police chief would investigate the three-eyed fish, would look into the cracked cooling towers, would want to know about the human skeletons in the plant's basement, would ask questions about the luminous rats and the plutonium paperweight, and the 342 safety violations that cost $56 million to address and were left unaddressed. Wiggum does not ask any of these questions. Wiggum is too busy eating donuts in his patrol car and issuing parking tickets to businesses that have already paid their protection money and losing evidence in cases that would embarrass important people. Wiggum is the correct police chief for Springfield, not by accident, by design. Springfield produces the law enforcement it requires, and what it requires is someone who will make the appropriate noises in the direction of accountability while ensuring that accountability never actually arrives anywhere inconvenient. The contamination theory notes that Wiggum, like every other resident of Springfield, also shows signs of the town's general cognitive impairment. His detective reasoning is not merely lazy. It does not work the way detective reasoning is supposed to work. He makes connections that are not there and misses connections that are obvious. His professional failures are too consistent and too comprehensive to be simply a matter of motivation. Something has also been happening to Wiggum's brain, and his position at the head of Springfield's law enforcement apparatus ensures that whatever that something has done to his reasoning capacity, it has done it to the person most capable of inconveniencing Burns. Apu Nahasapima Pedalan and the Quickie Mart. Apu is a character who has attracted considerable attention and controversy in the years since his initial creation, and that conversation exists and is worth having separately from what the theory observes about his function within Springfield. Within the world of the show, Apu runs the Quickie Mart. He runs it continuously across the show's entire run. He is there every day, every night, every hour that the store is open, which appears to be essentially all of them. He has a family. He has a social life of sorts. He has relationships with the other residents of Springfield. But the center of his existence within the show is the store. The Quickie Mart occupies a specific structural role in Springfield's community that the theory finds significant. It is the one place in Springfield that never closes. Every institution in Springfield that provides some form of communal service operates on a schedule. The school closes at 3. The hospital has visiting hours. Moe's has last call. Even the nuclear power plant theoretically has shifts that begin and end. The Quickie Mart is always open. At any hour of any day, regardless of what catastrophe has just befallen Springfield, regardless of what disaster or festival or civil disruption has reorganized the town's normal functioning, the Quickie Mart is open. Apu is behind the counter. The squishies are available. The hot dogs have been rotating on their little rollers for an indeterminate amount of time. The theory reads the Quickie Mart as Springfield's continuous constant. The thing that the show uses to anchor the community's sense of ongoing normality regardless of what happened in the previous episode. You can reset Springfield after a nuclear near miss, or an alien encounter, or the sun being blocked, and the evidence of the reset is the Quickie Mart being exactly as it always was. Apu at the counter, the squishies rotating, the expired products sitting on their shelves at the back. The Quickie Mart is Springfield's proof that the loop is still running. As long as it is open, the community is still in place, the reset has worked, and the comfortable fiction of Springfield's normalcy is intact. The coma theory makes something additional of this. In Homer's dream, the Quickie Mart and Apu serve as the dream's anchor point, the fixed landmark that tells Homer's unconscious mind that the simulation is still coherent. In a dream that keeps generating increasingly impossible events and increasingly exaggerated situations, the Quickie Mart remains consistent. It is there when Homer needs a squishy to carry through whatever strange storyline the episode has produced. It is Apu at the counter with a calm acknowledgement that yes, whatever just happened, this too is something that can be continued from. Dr. Nick Riviera and Springfield's medical establishment. Hi, everybody. Dr. Nick Riviera is Springfield's second most prominent physician, the one the family calls when their primary doctor is unavailable, or when the procedure they need is one that requires a certain flexibility around conventional medical standards. He is cheerful, enthusiastic, poorly trained, and operating at a level of professional confidence that has absolutely no relationship to his professional competence. He is also, the theory notes, a product of the same system that produced Homer's unchecked crayon. Springfield's medical establishment is represented primarily through two figures: Dr. Hibbert, who is presented as the town's competent and well-regarded physician, and Dr. Nick, who is presented as his comic counterpart. The show uses the contrast between them for comedic purposes. Hibbert represents legitimate medicine. Dr. Nick represents medicine operating outside the normal boundaries of training and ethical constraint. But the theory asks a different question about Springfield's medical establishment as a whole, beyond the individual competence of its practitioners. What does it mean that in a town with documented environmental contamination at levels severe enough to prompt federal enclosure, where the fish in the local water supply have developed extra eyes, where a man who operates the primary industrial facility glows visibly after his weekly treatments, where the safety inspector at that facility has been operating with a foreign object in his brain for his entire life, the medical establishment has never, across 36 years of episodes, produced any finding that connects the town's health outcomes to the plant? Not once. Not a single doctor in Springfield has stood up and said, "We have a contamination problem. We have a public health crisis traceable to the nuclear facility at the edge of town. We need to address this." Not Hibbert, who is presented as competent. Not Dr. Nick, who despite his incompetence presumably encounters the same patient population. Not the hospital administration, not the nursing staff, not any of the supporting medical characters the show has introduced across its run. The silence from Springfield's medical community, in the face of the evidence that the show has accumulated across hundreds of episodes, is as significant as any of the other silences we have examined tonight. The contamination theory holds that this silence is the product of the same institutional capture that produced Wiggum, a medical establishment that operates in a community dominated by one economic actor will over time organize itself around the requirements of that actor's continued operation. The patients keep coming with the symptoms they keep presenting, and the institution that is supposed to connect those symptoms to their causes has, quietly and systematically, decided not to make that connection. Not through individual corruption necessarily, through the accumulated institutional decision that some connections are more convenient than others, that some questions lead somewhere productive and some questions lead somewhere the questioner would rather not go. Springfield's doctors have decided which kind of question the contamination question is. They have decided unanimously, and in silence, and across 36 years. Sideshow Bob and the intelligence Springfield cannot contain. Robert Underdunk Terwilliger Jr., known to the show and to the audience as Sideshow Bob, is the most consistently brilliant character in Springfield outside of Mr. Burns, and he and Burns share a quality that the theory finds significant. Both of them are too intelligent for the environment they are in. Burns manages this by owning the environment. He owns the plant, the economic foundation, the institutional leverage, and through those things he owns the operating conditions of Springfield itself. His intelligence does not make him an outcast. It makes him the architect of the system that everyone else lives inside. Bob cannot own anything. His intelligence is the kind that expresses itself in culture and language and elaborate planning rather than in the acquisition and deployment of capital. He is a classically educated, operatically inclined, genuinely erudite man who has been, for reasons the show has partially explored, unable to find any expression for his intelligence in the world outside Springfield, and unable to find any accommodation for it within Springfield. His relationship to Bart is the show's most interesting secondary dynamic precisely because of what it represents at the structural level. Bob is the most capable mind available to serve as Springfield's antagonist, and his entire adult life has been organized around the destruction of a 10-year-old child. Not because the 10-year-old child is a worthy adversary for someone of Bob's capabilities, because the 10-year-old child, through a combination of luck and the specific cognitive quirks that come with being Bart Simpson, keeps defeating him. The theory reads this relationship as Springfield eating its own intelligences. The town cannot accommodate Bob's capacity. It cannot find a place for it, cannot reward it, cannot channel it productively. So his intelligence turns inward and downward toward the most immediately available target, which happens to be the child who first humiliated him. And every time Bob nearly succeeds in his objective and then fails at the last moment due to some improbable intervention, the loop resets. Bob goes to prison, serves his time, emerges, and begins again. The coma theory makes something touching of this. Homer's dream cannot quite generate a version of Sideshow Bob who succeeds. Because if Bob succeeds, Bart is dead, and Homer's dream cannot contain the death of his son. So Bob always comes close and always fails, reset after reset, because the dream has decided that Bart must live, and the dream will arrange whatever is necessary to ensure that happens. Bob is the most eloquent prisoner in the loop. He knows he is in it. He references it, in a certain sense, every time he pauses in the midst of an elaborate scheme to describe what he is doing, and why, with more self-awareness than anyone else in Springfield, applies to their own situation, he sees the cage. He simply cannot find the door. The Bouvier sisters and the marriage at the center of everything. Marge Bouvier married Homer Simpson, and the show has been exploring what that means and what it costs and what it gives back ever since. But the theory is interested in something slightly adjacent to the marriage itself. It is interested in the Bouvier family as a whole, and specifically in what the contrast between Marge and her sisters tells you about the contamination framework. Patty and Selma Bouvier are Marge's older sisters. They live in Springfield. They have lived in Springfield for the show's entire run. They work at the DMV, they smoke constantly, they watch their television programs, they maintain a collective disapproval of Homer that has never wavered across 36 years of episodes. They have not aged. Like everyone else in Springfield, they are frozen at the age they were at the show's beginning. Like everyone else in Springfield, the contamination theory would hold that their biology has been altered by the same exposure that has altered every other resident. But the theory finds them interesting for a different reason. Patty and Selma represent what Marge's life might have looked like without Homer. They are the road not taken, or rather, the road that runs parallel to hers, with some of the same characteristics and entirely different emotional texture. They are in Springfield. They are of Springfield. They share Marge's origins, and they have arrived at a completely different kind of life within the same environment. They are not happy. Exactly. The show does not depict them as happy, but they are self-contained in a way that Marge, who has organized her entire existence around a husband and children and a household, is not. They exist for themselves. They have each other. They have their routines and their preferences and their consistent presence in each other's lives. And they have, notably, never tried to leave Springfield. Marge has contemplated it across various episodes, has felt the pull of somewhere else, somewhere that might recognize things about her that Springfield consistently overlooks. But Patty and Selma have no apparent interest in leaving. The theory asks whether this is contentment or contamination. Whether the Bouvier sisters have found something genuinely satisfying in their Springfield lives, or whether the same cognitive impairment that keeps every other resident from questioning the system has simply removed their capacity to imagine anything beyond it. There is no clean answer. The theory leaves it open, but the question sits there, in every episode where Patty and Selma appear, in the narrow margins of what their lives contain, and the absence of any apparent awareness that the margins could be wider. The retirement castle and what it means to age in Springfield. The Springfield Retirement Castle is where Springfield's elderly residents live. It is underfunded, understaffed, and periodically structurally compromised by whatever catastrophe Burns has most recently arranged in the vicinity. Grandpa Simpson lives there, and Grandpa's existence within the retirement castle tells you something about what Springfield does with the people who have accumulated enough years to begin moving outside the frame of productive utility. Springfield takes care of its elderly the way it takes care of most things that do not have immediate economic value. It provides the minimum required by social expectation and legal obligation, and then it forgets about them. The retirement castle is one of Springfield's most consistently neglected institutions. Its residents are one of the town's most consistently overlooked populations. Grandpa is the character through whom the show most directly addresses what it means to be old in Springfield. And Grandpa's function in the show is interesting because he contains, more than almost any other character, the history of Springfield that the floating timeline has otherwise erased. Grandpa remembers things. He tells stories about events that happened before the show began, before Homer was born, before the nuclear plant was built. He is Springfield's longest living memory, and the show consistently treats his memories as irrelevant, as the rambling of an old man whose connection to the present moment is unreliable. But the theory holds that Grandpa's stories are the most important testimony available about what Springfield was before the contamination. He has memories of the town before the plant, before Burns's industrial operation reshaped the community around itself. He has memories of what normal looked like, of what the water was before the runoff, of what people were like before the decades of exposure, and nobody listens to him. He is in the retirement castle, and the retirement castle is where Springfield puts the people whose information is inconvenient. He made the deal with Burns. He knows about Mona. He knows more about the architecture of Springfield's current condition than he has ever been asked to share, and the people who would most benefit from his knowledge do not visit frequently enough to ask the right questions. Grandpa is Springfield's archive, and like the rest of Springfield's archives, the town has filed him somewhere that makes access inconvenient. Milhouse Van Houten and the child who sees too much. Milhouse is Bart's best friend, the show's most reliably unfortunate child, and one of the few characters the theory finds genuinely interesting for what his situation reveals about Springfield's effects on the next generation. Milhouse is sensitive. He feels things too much and processes them too slowly, and the world around him is consistently too fast and too hard for the emotional pace at which he operates. He is bullied by Nelson and the other children. He is humiliated regularly. He carries a torch for Lisa that she does not reciprocate, and that the show sometimes treats as comedy and sometimes as something much more genuine and much sadder. But Milhouse is also, unlike most of the children in Springfield, capable of a kind of perception that the show does not consistently reward. He notices things. He registers the emotional reality of situations that Bart moves through without pausing. He has a relationship to truth, to the actual texture of what is happening around him, that is more functional than Homer's and more immediately emotional than Lisa's. The contamination theory has something specific to say about Milhouse. If the radiation produces different effects in different individuals, if it can reduce Homer's cognition and amplify Maggie's, then the range of intermediate effects across Springfield's population would include people like Milhouse, people whose emotional sensitivity has been heightened by whatever the contamination does to neural development, who feel things with an intensity that is not comfortably housed in the environment they inhabit. Milhouse hurts more easily than the people around him. He recovers more slowly. He carries each difficult experience with him for longer. In a healthier environment, these qualities might be called emotional intelligence or empathic capacity. In Springfield, they function primarily as a source of vulnerability. The system has no use for emotional sensitivity. The system requires compliance and forgetting and the capacity to move past catastrophe without accumulating the weight of it. Milhouse is constitutionally incapable of this. He remembers, he feels, he cannot not feel. He is Springfield's most human child, and Springfield being what it is, that makes him the most regularly unfortunate one. Section 12. The show's relationship to its own history. The Simpsons has been on the air for 36 years, and in that time it has accumulated something that very few cultural objects ever accumulate, a history long enough to be in tension with itself. A history long enough that the early episodes and the recent episodes cannot both be fully true simultaneously, because the facts of each period contradict the facts of the other. The floating timeline, as we discussed, is part of how the show manages this, but the floating timeline is not the whole story. The show has, across its run, developed a much more complex and, in some ways, more interesting relationship to its own past than the floating timeline alone would suggest. The Golden Age and what made it. Fans of The Simpsons, when they speak of the show's best period, almost uniformly identify something like seasons 3 through 8 as the Golden Age. The specific boundaries are debated. Some people extend the range, some narrow it, but the general consensus around a period of exceptional quality is remarkably consistent. What made those seasons exceptional is worth examining, because the answer illuminates what the show is and what it does when it is doing it best. Golden Age episodes work because they have emotional honesty. Not realism, but honesty. They take their characters seriously. Homer's desire to be a good father is played as a genuine desire, not just a comedic premise. Marge's loneliness and her efforts to find meaning outside the household are treated as real and sympathetic. Lisa's frustrations with being brilliant in an environment that does not value brilliance are not just set up for jokes. Bart's rebelliousness is shown to come from somewhere, to be connected to something real in his experience. The comedy in the Golden Age episodes emerges from the collision between genuine human feeling and the absurd situations the show puts the characters in. The emotional core is stable. The satire operates around that stable core. What changed in the later seasons, what produced the quality shift that fans have been arguing about for decades, is that the emotional core became less stable. The characters became their jokes rather than people who made jokes. Homer's stupidity became a device rather than a quality with emotional roots. Marge's patience became an assumed background condition rather than something she had to actively maintain at personal cost. The coma theory says this is what happens when a dreaming brain loses fidelity. The early seasons of Homer's dream, when the brain is still relatively intact and working from recent memory, produce characters who feel real because Homer's memory of them is still precise. The later seasons produce characters who feel like exaggerations because the dream is working from degraded data, from impressions rather than full memories. The contamination theory says this is what happens when the cognitive impairment deepens over time. In the early seasons, the characters are thinking clearly enough to be fully themselves. As the contamination accumulates, the thinking becomes less clear and the characterization becomes less precise. Whatever the explanation, the phenomenon is real. Something changed. The question is what it tells us about the nature of the thing that changed. Continuity as a measure of trust. The show's relationship to its own continuity has evolved dramatically across its run. In the early seasons, continuity was maintained with considerable care. Characters remembered things that happened to them. Relationships developed in ways that reflected shared history. The world of Springfield felt internally consistent, in the sense that what happened in one episode was not contradicted in the next. This changed gradually, and then more dramatically as the show accumulated more seasons than any of its creators originally expected it to. Episodes began to contradict each other. Character histories were revised. Events that should have permanent consequences were quietly undone by the beginning of the next episode. The standard explanation is that this is the inevitable result of a show running for longer than any consistent creative team could maintain oversight over. Hundreds of writers have worked on The Simpsons across 36 seasons. No single person has an encyclopedic memory of everything that every episode has established. Contradictions accumulate. This explanation is true, but the theory does not dismiss the contradictions as mere production failure. The theory says the contradictions are themselves data. Every continuity error in the show is a moment where the dream lost coherence, where the dreaming brain allowed two incompatible things to be simultaneously true because it could no longer hold the entire simulation in consistent order, where the collective denial mechanism of Springfield allowed an event to be remembered in two different ways without anyone noticing the difference. The continuity errors are not the show failing. They are the show telling you, in the only way it can, that the story is not being told by a reliable narrator. That the world you are watching is not internally consistent, because internally consistent worlds are what you get when consciousness is fully operating. And consciousness in this show is precisely what is in question. The meta-episodes and what they reveal. The Simpsons has, across its run, produced a number of episodes that step outside the frame of the show's normal storytelling and comment on the show itself. The clip shows, the documentary episodes, the episodes where characters become aware of their own fictional status. These meta-episodes are worth examining because they reveal something about how the show's writers understand what they are making. The clip show format, used periodically across the show's run, presents the show's own history as something worth revisiting, as something with enough accumulated weight that returning to it is itself meaningful. When a character says "remember when," and the show cuts to a clip from a previous season, it is implying that the events of that previous season matter, that they are part of an ongoing story, that they contribute to the present. But the clip shows also, almost without exception, remind you of how many things happened that the characters cannot currently remember. The clip show selections frequently include events that the relevant characters have forgotten entirely by the following episode. The show is showing you its own memory, while simultaneously demonstrating that its characters do not share that memory. The gap between what the show remembers and what the characters remember is the gap the contamination theory and the coma theory are describing. The show from the outside has a history. The characters, from the inside, have been partially relieved of that history by the mechanisms we have been discussing all evening. The meta-episodes confirm that the show is aware of this gap. The writers know that the characters should remember more than they do. They are not under the impression that the resets are invisible. They are making an active, ongoing choice to maintain the resets, and the meta-episodes are the moments when the show acknowledges that choice. What the Treehouse of Horror episodes tell you. The annual Halloween anthology episodes, running under the Treehouse of Horror banner since the show's second season, are formally outside the canonical continuity of the show. They are presented as non-canonical from the beginning. Things that happen in them do not affect the show's ongoing story. Characters who die in them are alive in the next episode without explanation because their deaths were never part of the real story. The theory finds this framing significant. The Treehouse of Horror episodes are Springfield's id. They are the content that the show cannot contain within its normal framework, the stories that require the escape valve of the non-canonical label to be told. Graphic death, existential horror, the darkest implications of what Springfield is, the most disturbing versions of what the contamination and the coma and the collective denial might produce if allowed to run to their logical conclusions. The show cordons all of this off. It labels it not real. It puts it in a box called Halloween and allows the audience to consume it as entertainment rather than as information about Springfield's actual nature. But the theory holds that the Treehouse of Horror episodes are the most honest content the show produces. Precisely because they are labeled non-canonical, they can say the things that the canonical episodes have to find indirect ways to say. The contamination can be depicted as full-body horror. The death can be permanent. The monsters can be recognized as monsters rather than presented as quirky background details. The Halloween episodes are what Springfield looks like when the denial mechanism is turned off. When the collective agreement to maintain comfortable fictions is temporarily suspended in favor of what is actually there, they are more real than the real episodes. And the show's insistence on labeling them fake is itself the most canonical thing it does. Section 13. Springfield as America. The political reading. We have spent most of this exploration treating Springfield as a specific place with specific theories about why it works the way it works. But the show has always been doing something beyond world building. It has always been making an argument about the broader society that Springfield is designed to represent. The Simpsons is set in America, not a specific part of America, as we have discussed at length. All of it, every part simultaneously. And the impossibility of Springfield's geography is the spatial equivalent of the claim the show is making about its subject. Springfield is everywhere in America because Springfield is a portrait of America, of what America contains, of what America does to the people who live inside it. The nuclear plant as late capitalism. The nuclear power plant is not just a source of contamination within the theory's framework. It is also the show's central symbol for a specific kind of economic arrangement. Burns owns the plant. Burns owns the town's only source of power. Burns employs a significant portion of the town's population. Burns controls the economic foundation of every other business and institution in Springfield by controlling the thing that makes all of them possible: electricity. This is monopoly. Not in the board game sense, but in the structural economic sense. Burns has captured the essential infrastructure of Springfield's economy and used that capture to make himself indispensable to every person in the community. You cannot opt out of Burns's power supply. You cannot shop elsewhere for your electricity. You cannot generate your own power without resources that Burns's pricing structure has made unavailable to you. The plant is late capitalism's most concentrated form, the private ownership of public necessity, deployed to extract maximum value from a population that has no alternative but to participate. And the contamination, the radiation that seeps into the water and the air and the biology of every Springfield resident, is the show's image of what this arrangement does to the people inside it. Not as allegory exactly. The show is too precise and too specific in its construction for allegory to be quite the right word. As documentation, the plant contaminates the people it exploits. The system that extracts value from the labor and the consumption of a captive population also damages the capacity of that population to recognize its own captivity. Homer cannot think clearly enough to understand what his employer is doing to him. This is not incidental. It is the arrangement working as designed. The town's political dysfunction. Springfield's municipal government is a recurring target for the show's satire, and the picture the satire produces across hundreds of episodes is remarkably consistent. Mayor Quimby is corrupt. He has always been corrupt. His corruption is so consistent and so comprehensive that it has become a personality trait rather than a political scandal. He accepts bribes, he engages in nepotism, he redirects public funds toward private benefit. He makes policy decisions based on immediate personal advantage rather than long-term community welfare. The show depicts Quimby as corrupt and makes jokes about the corruption and then moves on, episode after episode, with Quimby still in office, still corrupt, still the same man he has always been. The theory asks why. Not why the jokes are funny, but why within the logic of Springfield's universe, Quimby has never faced meaningful accountability for anything he has done. The answer the theory arrives at is the same answer it arrives at for Burns, for Wiggum, for the medical establishment's silence. Accountability requires a functioning set of civic institutions with the independence and the will to impose it. Springfield's civic institutions have been organized around the requirements of their dominant economic actor for long enough that they no longer possess that independence. The corruption is not an aberration that a better political moment might correct. It is the system functioning as it has been shaped to function. Burns does not need to own Quimby the way he might own a business. He needs the environment to produce people like Quimby, and the environment, having been designed by Burns's long-term influence over the town's economy and institutions, reliably does so. Lisa's position and what it costs her. Lisa Simpson is the most politically engaged character in Springfield. She is the one who sees the systems clearly, who names what she sees, who argues for what is right regardless of whether the argument will be well received. She is also the most politically ineffective character in Springfield. Not because her arguments are wrong, because the environment she inhabits has been shaped in ways that make her effectiveness structurally impossible. The show has depicted Lisa advocating for environmental protection, for animal rights, for educational equity, for political transparency, for democratic accountability, for the rights of people the community has overlooked. She is right about all of these things, consistently and with careful reasoning, and nothing she advocates for ever changes anything. Springfield's environmental contamination continues. The animals remain in whatever condition she found distressing. The educational inequity persists. The political corruption continues. The democratic processes produce outcomes that serve Burns and Quimby and the institutional infrastructure they represent. The theory holds that Lisa's ineffectiveness is not a writing failure or a comedic choice. It is the most accurate thing the show says about how change works in systems designed to resist it. A single intelligent voice, correctly identifying the problems of a system, cannot change that system from within. Not when the system's beneficiaries have enough institutional control to absorb the voice without being threatened by it. Lisa is heard. The show is careful to establish that she is heard. People listen to Lisa, and then they do not change. Because hearing the argument and acting on it are two completely different things, and the second requires a redistribution of power that the people in power are not going to voluntarily allow. Lisa is right, and Springfield does not change. This is not a children's show making a cynical argument about the futility of political engagement. It is an adult show making an accurate observation about how power works. And the fact that it makes this observation through the experience of an 8-year-old girl does not make it less accurate. It makes it more heartbreaking. Homer as the average, and what that means. Homer Simpson was not always America's image of average. In the show's early seasons, he was a specific character, with a specific psychology and specific qualities that were his, and not simply placeholders for audience identification. But somewhere in the show's run, Homer became something else. He became the everyman, the common man. The representation of the average American, in his appetites and his laziness, and his capacity for love, and his resistance to intellectual effort, and his fundamental decency underneath the flaws. The theory finds this transformation significant and troubling. If Homer is America's image of average, And if Homer is, as the contamination theory holds, a man whose cognitive capacity has been damaged by decades of radiation exposure, whose judgment is compromised, whose ability to understand the systems around him is deliberately maintained below the threshold required to challenge them, then what is the show saying about the American average? It is saying that the average has been arranged. That the cognitive and political passivity of the average American is not a natural condition of the population, but a produced condition. That the same forces that keep Homer from understanding his own situation at the nuclear plant are operating at a broader scale on the population that Homer represents. The plant is bigger than Springfield. The plant is everywhere. And the effects it produces in Springfield, the impaired cognition, the institutional incapacity, the collective forgetting, the willingness to accept contamination rather than challenge the source of it, these are not local conditions. They are American conditions. Homer is the average. And Homer cannot think clearly enough to understand why he is average. Springfield is America. And America, the show has been quietly suggesting for 36 years, cannot think clearly enough to understand why it is Springfield. Section 14. The long view. What 36 years means. We are near the end of our time in Springfield tonight. Let me slow down for a moment and think about what it means that this show has been running for as long as it has been running, 36 years. Most people who are alive in the world right now were born after The Simpsons began. The show has been running for longer than the adult lives of most of its current audience. It has been running through the Cold War's end, through the internet's emergence, through multiple economic crises, through the rise and fall and rise again of various political movements, through technological transformations that would have been unrecognizable in December 1989 when the first episode aired. And through all of it, Bart has been 10 years old. There is something in this that goes beyond any single theory we have discussed tonight. Something about what it means to have a cultural object that has been present for that long, that has been a reference point for that many different periods of American life, that has accumulated enough shared audience experience to function as something almost like a collective memory. The show as time capsule. Earlier episodes of The Simpsons function, for people who watch them now, as time capsules of the period in which they were made. The cultural references, the technology depicted, the prices mentioned in background details, the fashion, the music, all of it anchors those episodes in a specific moment of American life. But the characters do not belong to those moments. They are the same characters they have always been, dropped into whatever period the episode was produced in, absorbing the cultural texture of that period without being changed by it. This creates a strange temporality. You can watch a 1993 episode and understand it as being from 1993, as having been made in a specific moment and reflecting that moment's concerns. But Homer in that episode is the same Homer who exists in a 2024 episode. He carried no information from 1993 into 1994. He brings no accumulated weight of experience from any of the periods the show has moved through. He is the same man, always. In every moment the show has ever depicted, the coma theory says this is because he is dreaming. The contamination theory says this is because the radiation has arrested the biological processes that would normally allow time to accumulate on a person. The collective denial framework says this is because Springfield will not allow its residents to age, because aging means acknowledging that time is passing, and acknowledging that time is passing is the first step toward acknowledging everything else that is passing with it. But there's a reading beyond all of these, a reading that does not require any of the theories, that sits alongside them without contradicting them. Homer is the same because we need him to be the same, not as a psychological need in the individual viewer, though that need is real and we discussed it in the floating timeline section, as a cultural need, a need at the level of the society that has organized itself, in part, around this show and what it represents. America needs Homer Simpson to be the same Homer Simpson he was in 1989, because Homer in 1989 represented something about what American life was or could be or felt like from the inside, and that representation, frozen at that moment, has become a landmark, a fixed point. Something that the culture can orient itself around when everything else is moving too fast to feel stable. The Simpsons has been running for 36 years because the culture has needed it to run for 36 years. Because every period of American life since December 1989 has contained enough upheaval and uncertainty and rapid change that the fixed point of Springfield, the family on the couch, the opening credits running exactly as they always run, represents something genuinely valuable. Not truth, not accuracy, stability, the feeling that something is still what it was. We have kept the show running for the same reason Springfield keeps forgetting its own disasters. Because the alternative is too much to face all at once. What ending would mean? The Simpsons will end someday. All shows end. The institutional, financial, and human realities that have sustained 36 seasons of production cannot be sustained indefinitely. At some point, the people who make the show will either choose to end it or the circumstances will choose for them. And when it ends, something specific will happen in the culture. People will have to acknowledge that Bart Simpson is done being 10 years old, that the family on Evergreen Terrace has run out of Sunday nights, that the opening credits will not be playing next week. This is, underneath all the theories and all the mysteries and all the careful analysis we have done tonight, the thing that the floating timeline is protecting against. Not for the characters, for us. The timeline floats because the show's end, when it comes, will be the real thing that all the theories have been circling around without naming. It will be time passing, catching up, arriving in the form of a finale, a final episode, a last time the theme plays. And every year the show continues. Every season that gets renewed, every episode that airs with the same family in the same house with the same impossibly young children, is another year that moment is deferred. We have been deferring it since 1989, the ending that already happened. Here is the coma theory's most haunting final thought, the one it saves for last. If Homer has been in a coma since April 1993, then in a certain sense, the show already ended in April 1993. The ending happened in a hospital room when a vending machine fell on a man and he did not wake up. Everything since then has been epilogue. 32 years of epilogue generated by the unconscious mind of someone who is technically already gone from the waking world. The show has been running since 1989. Homer has been dreaming since 1993. And somewhere between those two dates, between the show that existed and the dream that replaced it, the real ending occurred. We just did not know to mourn it when it happened. Because the dream kept going. Because the family was still there, in the house, with the beer cold and the couch waiting, and Bart doing something inadvisable, and Lisa playing her saxophone, and Maggie watching it all with eyes that see more than anyone around her understands. Because Homer's brain, even as it was losing 5% of its function, refused to let the story end, refused to let the family dissolve, refused to go dark on a scene where the last thing visible was an empty couch and a television and the sound of a theme song fading out. Instead, it kept going, and going, and going. And here we are tonight, 32 years into the dream, listening to Springfield breathe, watching the cooling tower's light blink against a sky the show has always colored slightly wrong, the orange just a shade too warm, the stars not quite positioned the way any real sky positions them. Dreaming alongside Homer, of a family, of a house, of an ordinary Tuesday evening that never has to become Wednesday. Section 15. The smaller mysteries Springfield left unsolved. Before we arrive at the closing, there are smaller mysteries that have accumulated over the years. Not the grand unified theories, not the structural frameworks, just specific questions, specific moments, specific things that happened in an episode and were never addressed again. The kind of thing that sits in the back of your mind when you watch a rerun. The kind of thing that the show planted and then walked away from, leaving it there in the canon to be found by whoever happened to be paying close enough attention. These smaller mysteries are worth naming. Not because they require elaborate theoretical frameworks to make sense of, but because they each add texture to the larger picture, and because taken together they form a portrait of a show that was always doing more than it appeared to be doing. The oil money and where it really went. In the episode where the school discovers oil beneath its grounds, the oil money is stolen by Burns through a legal mechanism. But there is a moment in that episode, a brief scene, where the school's sudden wealth is depicted as already having begun to circulate through Springfield's economy before Burns intervenes. Money flows in Springfield in ways the show depicts but rarely follows. When Burns steals the oil money, where exactly does it go? Not into some abstract corporate account. Into the infrastructure Burns controls, into the investments Burns makes, into the operations of a man whose financial activities are spread across enough institutions that tracking any single flow of capital would require exactly the kind of sustained institutional attention that Springfield's compromised regulatory environment is not capable of providing. The oil money flows out of Springfield and into Burns's empire, and what it funds there, what research programs it sustains, what medical interventions it makes possible, the show never specifies. But the contamination theory holds that resources flowing toward Burns's empire are resources that will eventually be directed, at least in part, toward the maintenance of Burns himself. Every dollar stolen from Springfield Elementary partially funds the treatments that keep the man who stole it alive to steal again. The money that would have fixed the school's roof goes toward the medical apparatus that prevents the billionaire from dying of radiation poisoning long enough to come up with another scheme. The loop is closed and the children at Springfield Elementary sit under a leaking ceiling in a building where the science lab equipment has not been replaced since before most of their parents were born. This is not incidental. The defunding of the school and the funding of Burns's longevity are two expressions of the same transfer, two ends of a pipe. The community's investment in its own future flows directly toward the maintenance of the man who benefits from the community having no future it is capable of investing in. The water nobody tests. Springfield's water supply is never the subject of a sustained investigation within the show, despite the documented evidence of contamination that we have cataloged at length tonight. This is strange when you sit with it. Within the world the show has built, within a community where the fish have 3 eyes and where a federal agency has determined the town is a contamination zone, you would expect someone to have tested the water at some point and published the results. Or rather, you would expect this if Springfield functioned the way a community with functional institutions functions. The show depicts the water being consumed continuously. Tap water in the Simpson house, water at the school, water at the hospital and the courthouse, and every other institution that makes Springfield a place where people live organized lives. Homer has drunk this water his entire life. Bart and Lisa and Maggie have drunk from it since they were born, and no results have ever been published within the show's universe. No study has ever been conducted that established contamination levels in Springfield's water supply and connected those levels to the plant's discharge. The theory holds that the absence of such results is itself a result. Water testing in a town owned by the man whose facility contaminates the water would produce findings that would require either remediation or accountability. Springfield's institutions, organized around Burns's requirements, have determined that neither of those outcomes is desirable, so the testing does not happen. The results do not exist. You can only be required to address what has been documented. In Springfield, nothing inconvenient is ever documented. The fish have 3 eyes. The fish are not documented in any ongoing monitoring program. The cooling tower is patched with gum. The patching material is not documented in any maintenance record that would trigger an inspection. The skeletons are in the basement. Nobody has filed a report that would require explaining the skeletons. Springfield's record-keeping is, perhaps, its most sophisticated defense mechanism. The absence of documentation is not negligence. It is strategy. The Maggie moment that is more than it appears? There is an episode in the show's early run where Homer is leaving for work, and Maggie, in her infant carrier, appears to reach out after him. Homer, not seeing this, narrates aloud that Maggie is the one who needs him most. The moment is played for emotional warmth. It is a brief, gentle scene in a show that had many such scenes in its early seasons when the emotional core was maintained with more consistency and the comedy emerged from recognizable human feeling rather than escalating absurdity. But the theory looks at this moment and finds it more complicated than it initially appears. If Maggie's intelligence is as extensive as the evidence suggests, then her smile in this scene is not simply an infant's instinctive response to a familiar caregiver. It is Maggie, already operating with considerable cognitive capacity, producing the response that the situation calls for. She is giving Homer what he needs. She is being the baby he needs her to be in this moment, because she understands that Homer's sense of being needed by her serves a function in the household's emotional ecology. This might seem like reading too much into a brief scene, but the theory holds that Maggie's intelligence, if it is operating at the level the evidence suggests, would necessarily include social intelligence of exactly this kind. The capacity to read what a situation requires and produce the appropriate response. The capacity to manage her own presentation in ways that serve outcomes she has determined are desirable. She keeps Homer emotionally engaged with his role as a father. She gives him the experience of being needed, which the contamination theory holds is one of the few things strong enough to keep Homer tethered to his daily life, despite everything that daily life requires him to endure. She is already, at whatever age she is when this scene occurs, doing what she will spend 36 years doing, reading the room, producing what the room requires, remaining invisible in her capacity while making herself felt in her warmth. She is managing the family from the carrier. She has always been managing the family, Chief Wiggum and the enforcement that doesn't enforce. Chief Clancy Wiggum is the head of the Springfield Police Department. This single fact, examined carefully, is one of the show's most sustained and most devastating jokes. Wiggum is not simply an incompetent individual who has ended up in a position of authority through whatever combination of luck and institutional dysfunction produces incompetent people in positions of authority. Wiggum is the product of a system. He is what the system produces when it needs law enforcement that will maintain the appearance of accountability without producing any actual accountability. A genuinely competent police chief in Springfield would be a structural problem for Burns. A genuinely competent police chief would investigate the contamination, would follow the evidence from the three-eyed fish to the plant, would pursue the question of the human skeletons in the basement, would want to understand why a man with 342 safety violations has been allowed to continue operating for decades without consequence. Wiggum does not ask any of these questions. He is busy eating donuts and accepting bribes and issuing parking tickets and losing evidence and misinterpreting criminal situations in ways that consistently benefit the people who most need their criminal situations misinterpreted. He is not doing this badly. He is doing it exactly right, from the perspective of the system that produced him. Springfield's law enforcement apparatus is not failing. It is succeeding at the function it was actually designed to perform, which is not public safety but public management. Keeping the population feeling that the norms of civil society are being maintained while ensuring that those norms are never applied in ways that threaten the institutional arrangements that Burns has spent a century building. The contamination theory notes that Wiggum, like everyone else in Springfield, is also cognitively affected by the town's environment. His reasoning does not work the way detective reasoning is supposed to work. He makes wrong connections and misses obvious ones, with a consistency that goes beyond mere laziness or disengagement. Something is also happening to Wiggum's brain, which means the person most capable of inconveniencing Burns through the application of law enforcement authority is also the person whose capacity for that application has been most thoroughly compromised by what Burns's facility has done to the community's neural environment. The system protects itself through the thing that is supposed to constrain it. Sideshow, Bob and the intelligence that cannot find its place. Robert Underdunk Terwilliger Jr., known to everyone as Sideshow Bob, is the most consistently brilliant character in Springfield outside of Burns himself. The theory is interested in what this pair represents. Two men in Springfield with genuine intellectual capacity that exceeds everyone around them. One of them owns the town. One of them cannot find a productive place in it and has organized his adult life around the destruction of a 10-year-old child. Burns manages his intelligence by directing it toward the acquisition and maintenance of power. His cognitive capacity is his primary tool, and he has deployed it across a century and more of operation with devastating effectiveness. He owns the infrastructure. He controls the institutions. He has made himself indispensable to the community in ways that protect him from the consequences of his own actions. Bob cannot own anything because the kind of intelligence he has, the kind that expresses itself in culture and language and elaborate planning, does not translate directly into the acquisition of capital. He is a classically educated, operatically inclined, genuinely erudite man who has found no accommodation in Springfield and no comfortable existence outside it. His campaign against Bart is, under the theory, the expression of an intelligence that has found no outlet except this: no productive application, no way to exist in Springfield on terms that are not defined by humiliation and constraint. Every elaborate scheme Bob develops is, at its core, an exercise of his intelligence in the one domain where it can be fully expressed: the planning, the execution, the construction of complex systems aimed at a specific outcome. He is brilliant and trapped, and his brilliance keeps turning in the only direction the trap allows. The coma theory makes something else of Bob. Homer's dream, which is capable of generating most threats and resolving them in Homer's favor, cannot permanently eliminate Sideshow Bob. He returns. He escapes. He constructs new schemes. He is the dream's most persistent antagonist, the one the dream keeps generating, because Homer's sleeping mind needs a worthy opponent in the story it is telling about protecting Bart. Homer's brain generates a brilliant enemy because Homer's deepest narrative about his son requires one. Not a negligent or simple danger, but an intelligent, committed one, the kind that requires Bart to be genuinely clever and lucky and supported by his family to survive. Bob is the dream's tribute to Bart's capacity. You do not need Sideshow Bob to threaten a child who does not have anything worth threatening, the school and the failure built into it. Springfield Elementary has been the site of some of the show's most consistent educational satire, and the picture across hundreds of episodes is one of institutional failure at every level. Principal Skinner, we now know, is not actually Principal Skinner. He is a man who took someone else's identity and has been running an underfunded public school under that borrowed name for 20 years. The resources are perpetually inadequate. The facilities deteriorate without being repaired. The teaching staff includes people who have been exhausted by the work for long enough that their exhaustion has become their primary professional characteristic. Bart fails consistently and spectacularly. His failure is part of his identity within Springfield. He has organized his sense of self around being the person who does not succeed by institutional metrics. And the institution has organized its response to him around the expectation of that failure, which means it stops trying to address the failure and simply documents it instead. Lisa succeeds easily, which means the institution has nothing to offer her. She has exhausted what the school can provide years before the show begins. Every day at Springfield Elementary is a day that could be spent being challenged, but is instead spent waiting for the class to catch up to a place Lisa passed through before anyone else arrived. The school cannot serve either of its most interesting students. It produces Bart's failure and Lisa's frustration with equal consistency because it was not built for either of them. It was built for a median that the contamination theory holds has been shaped by decades of radiation exposure into something below what it would otherwise be. The school's mediocrity is calibrated to a student population whose cognitive baseline has been lowered by the environment they are growing up in. It is teaching to the contamination's outcome, meeting the students where the plant has put them rather than where they might otherwise be. The Fat Tony equilibrium. Springfield has an organized crime presence. Fat Tony DiMaggio operates it with the cheerful transparency that the show applies to all of its criminal actors. The mob is visibly criminal in the same way that Burns is visibly corrupt. Springfield is a town where the illegitimate power structures are exactly as open about their operations as the legitimate ones, because in Springfield the distinction between legitimate and illegitimate has been worn down by the same institutional capture that produced Wiggum. The theory finds Fat Tony significant for one specific reason. He has never challenged Burns. In a community where Burns has destroyed businesses and livelihoods and family structures and environmental quality for decades, the one institutional actor with independent enforcement capacity and no formal obligation to the legitimate power structures has never brought that capacity to bear against Burns. This could mean a division of territory, an understanding between the criminal infrastructure and the industrial one about what each controls, an accommodation that keeps them from direct conflict, because direct conflict would cost both sides more than the current arrangement does. Or it could mean that Burns's institutional capture is more comprehensive than it appears from the outside, that the mob has been accommodated the way the police have been accommodated, that the independence Fat Tony represents is less complete than it looks. Or it could simply mean that Fat Tony is wise, that he has observed, across years of operating in Springfield, what happens to people who challenge Burns directly, and has made the calculation that the available territory is sufficient without taking on the one fight that nobody in the history of Springfield has ever been in a position to win. The theory leaves this open, but it notes the absence. In a town where Burns controls the essential infrastructure and has used that control to do demonstrable harm without consequence, the one actor capable of operating outside the normal consequence structure has chosen not to act. That silence is its own kind of information. The episode Nobody Made. There is a recurring feature of the Simpsons fan community worth acknowledging before we close this section. The episodes that feel like they should exist but do not. An episode where Lisa follows the evidence all the way, where she connects Blinky to the water, to the hands, to the skin, to the cognitive impairments, to the institutional failures, where she constructs the argument the contamination theory makes and takes it to the community, where she demands that someone listen. This episode does not exist. The show has never directly depicted a character making the connection that the contamination theory makes. Never shown someone following the evidence from the fish to the people in the way that 36 years of accumulated episodes make logically available. Never shown the investigation that the canon demands be possible. The theory holds that this is not an oversight. The episode does not exist because Springfield will not allow it to exist. Because a character who makes this connection, who presents this case, would have to be addressed by the show, would have to be right or wrong or silenced or exiled. And all of those options lead somewhere the show has chosen not to go. Lisa could make the case. She has the information, she has the intelligence, she has the motivation, but she lives in Springfield, and Springfield has never let the case be made. That is the most efficient summary of everything the contamination theory argues, and of everything that the principal and the pauper showed us about Springfield's relationship to inconvenient truth. Lisa has the evidence. Springfield has agreed not to hear it. And the episode where she tries anyway, and what Springfield does in response, is the one the show has been building toward for 36 years without ever arriving. Maybe that is the final mystery. Not what the evidence shows, but what would happen if someone made the town look at it. We already know what Springfield does with the last honest person who shows up with the truth. They put him on a train, closing the things we carry out of Springfield. The final thesis on each member of the family. Before we leave Springfield, let us stop and spend one last quiet moment with each member of the Simpson family, not summarizing the theories. Just sitting with who they are, in the light of everything we have discussed tonight, and letting that be enough. Homer J. Simpson. He is the man the show built its entire structure around, and the more carefully you look at him, the stranger and sadder and more generous that structure appears. He is a man who was broken before he could understand what was being done to him, whose mother was taken away by an act of deliberate retaliation that he was too young to know about and too damaged to trace when he grew up, whose cognitive capacity was reduced, physically, by an object in his brain that the medical establishment around him chose not to remove, whose job is guaranteed not by his competence but by a deal between his father and the man who caused his family's wreckage, whose daily exposure to the facility where he works continues to do to him what it has been doing to him for his entire adult life, and who, despite all of this, loves his family with a completeness that the show returns to in every season. Not because the love makes the damage acceptable, because the love and the damage coexist in him, the way they coexist in real people, neither one canceling the other out. Homer is broken. Homer loves his family. Both things are entirely, equally true. Marge Bouvier Simpson. She is the load-bearing wall of the household, not in the passive sense that word sometimes implies, in the literal structural sense. Without Marge actively maintaining the conditions of the family's coherence, the family does not cohere. She does this not because she has no needs of her own or no desires beyond the family's welfare. She does it because she has looked at the available options and decided that this family, this husband, this life on Evergreen Terrace with all its compromises and its frustrations and its inexplicable disasters, is worth maintaining. That decision is renewed in every episode where she chooses to stay. It is not the absence of a choice. It is the most important choice in the show. Bartholomew Jojo Simpson. He is the show's most misread character, which is saying something in a show full of characters that the audience consistently underestimates. Bart is not simply a troublemaker. He is a child who has absorbed the message of his environment, the message that the systems around him do not reliably serve him, and has organized his entire self around the rejection of those systems. His pranks and his resistance and his refusal to be what Springfield Elementary needs him to be are not pathological. They are the appropriate response of someone who has correctly assessed that the path defined for him leads nowhere worth going. He is also, underneath all of this, a child who loves his family fiercely and completely in the way that children who are afraid of losing things love them. His relationship with Homer has more genuine tenderness in it than the surface of their interactions usually reveals. He protects Lisa in ways he would never admit to. He is complicated and specific and real in ways that the later seasons lost and the early seasons captured with something close to perfection. Lisa Marie Simpson. Everything we have said about her tonight is true. She sees clearly. She is right. The systems around her are exactly what she says they are. And she fights them anyway, every episode, even knowing that the fighting produces nothing immediate, nothing that can be measured in outcomes. She fights them because she cannot not fight them, because her intelligence will not allow her to accept what it sees without registering a protest, because somewhere in her is the understanding that the protest matters even when the protest does not change anything. That bearing witness is its own function. That asking the question, even when the question goes unanswered, is not the same as silence. Lisa is the canary that Springfield has not yet put on a train. And the show's greatest quiet mercy is that it has, for 36 seasons, kept her here, kept her 8 years old and fighting, kept her raising her hand in a classroom that does not know what to do with what she has to offer. Margaret Evelyn Simpson. She is watching. She is always watching. And when she finally decides to speak, Springfield will discover that the silence was not empty, that it was full of everything she observed, everything she stored, everything she understood about this town and this family and this loop they are all caught inside. What she will do with that understanding, where she will direct what has been accumulating behind those enormous watching eyes, the show has never told us. Maybe that is the point. Maybe the show has been building toward Maggie's voice for 36 years. Maybe the final word of the series, the thing that closes the loop and ends the dream, is the word Maggie has been waiting to say since Elizabeth Taylor voiced her first one. Daddy, whether it is genuinely late where you are, or early in the dark morning hours before the house fills with sound, or the quiet middle of an afternoon that has its own particular silence, it is late in the way that the end of a long journey is always late. You have been somewhere for a long time. You have looked at things you will not be able to unsee. Let us take a moment with everything we found. We went into the contamination theory and we found a case built over 3 decades of episodes. Case by case, detail by detail. In the three-eyed fish, and the luminous rats, and the four-fingered hands, and the overbites, and the man who glows after his medical treatments. We found a billionaire who knows exactly what his plant is doing to the people around it and has calculated, across decades of operational decisions, that the benefits of continuing outweigh the costs. We found a safety inspector whose very incapacity is his most valuable professional quality. We found a population that cannot quite think clearly enough to ask why things are the way they are. We went into the coma theory, and we found a date, the 1st of April 1993, and a vending machine, and a 5% reduction in brain function that the show treated as a joke and that the theory treats as the last clear factual report from Homer's waking life. We found 32 years of increasingly impossible episodes that map precisely onto what you would expect from a brain-generating dream content on degrading hardware. We found a man who just wants his family to be okay and has been dreaming them into safety for 3 decades because it is the only way he can reach them. We went into the Burns shooting case and we found a contest that nobody won, a sundial clue that the victim himself described as coincidental, a gun that was already missing before the shooting occurred, a last utterance that implies recognition rather than alarm, and a confession from Homer in season 18 that the show filed and forgot. We found a case that was declared closed in 1995 and that has never quite felt solved. We traced Burns's immortality to its source and found a medical apparatus built around weekly radiation treatments, a disease equilibrium maintained by those treatments rather than by any natural biological process, and an assistant whose devotion to his employer is functionally indistinguishable from a life support system. We found a man who is too expensive to die because the system he built requires his continued existence and will do whatever the system can do to maintain it. We sat with the principal and the pauper and understood, perhaps for the first time without the defensive layer of, it was just a bad episode protecting us from it, what the episode is actually showing. We watched a community vote to make truth illegal. We watched the last honest man get put on a train. We understood that this vote happens in Springfield in every episode that ends with the catastrophe forgotten and the baseline restored. We just usually do not see the vote. We just see the result. We spent time with Maggie's silence and found in it not absence but architecture. A mind that has been watching and storing and waiting for 36 years, behind the pacifier, and behind the enormous eyes, and behind the strategic invisibility of someone who learned from watching her sister what visibility costs. We left her there, still watching, still waiting, still entirely unknown in her intentions and her endgame. We walked through the prediction phenomenon and arrived somewhere more interesting than either conspiracy or debunking could take us. We found a feedback loop between the show and the culture, a loop that has been running for 36 years, in which the show's satire normalizes the future, and the future arrives feeling recognizable rather than new. We found a show that does not predict America so much as it has become part of the medium through which America understands itself. We followed Mona Simpson's trail from a Springfield neighborhood in 1969 to a biological weapons lab to 27 years of exile and finally to a hospital bed where her son held her hand while she left. We traced the damage of Burns's retaliation through 3 generations. We found Homer at the center of it, too damaged to see the shape of what was done to him, working every day for the man who arranged the damage. We looked for Springfield on the map. We found it everywhere. We understood that this is the point, that a town which cannot be located cannot be regulated, that a facility in a jurisdiction that keeps shifting cannot be held consistently accountable, that the geographic ambiguity is not an inconsistency in the show's production, but a protective strategy embedded in its design. We stared at the floating timeline until it stared back. We understood that nobody ages in Springfield because we will not allow it, because the loop is not the show's trap. It is ours. We built it in 1989, and we have been maintaining it ever since, and we will continue maintaining it for as long as the show continues, and for some time after, because you do not simply stop needing a fixed point when the fixed point goes away. You find another one, or you carry the memory of the first one. Every theory is different. They use different evidence and different logic and arrive through different doors. The contamination theory is environmental and political and medical. The coma theory is psychological and emotional and deeply personal. The Skinner framework is sociological and institutional. The Burns immortality theory is economic and medical and gothic in a way that feels appropriate to the character. The prediction framework is cultural and statistical, and finally about what it means for a show to exist inside the culture it depicts for long enough that the boundary between the two becomes porous. But they all say the same thing. Something is wrong in Springfield. Something fundamental. Something structural. Something that was built into this place before the first episode aired and has been operating continuously, beneath every joke and every pratfall and every reset, ever since. And the show knows. It has always known. The three-eyed fish in Season 2 was not a throwaway gag. It was a declaration. This is what the contamination is doing. This is what the system produces. We are showing you the fish. The question was always whether we were going to ask about the people. Tonight, we asked. And we found in the asking something the show has been waiting 36 years for someone to notice, that Springfield is not a quirky cartoon town with a lovable buffoon at its center. It is a portrait of what a community looks like when one man has owned its essential infrastructure for long enough that the community has organized itself around his requirements. What a family looks like when it has been growing inside a contamination zone for its entire existence without knowing it. What a population looks like when its collective capacity for critical thinking has been slowly, systematically reduced by the thing that provides its power. And underneath all of that, in the quiet at the center of every theory, in the place the coma theory reaches when it follows its own logic all the way down, a man and his family, and the love that does not require intelligence or clarity or any of the things that Springfield has taken from him. Homer loves his family. That is the fixed point. That is the thing that does not change across 36 seasons, across every contamination and every reset and every impossible adventure and every forgotten catastrophe. He loves Marge. He loves Bart. He loves Lisa. He loves Maggie. And if he is dreaming, if this whole thing has been a dream since April 1993, then the dream is the proof that this love is real. Because you do not dream this precisely, this consistently, this persistently, about something that does not matter. You dream what you cannot bear to lose. Springfield will be there when you open your eyes. The cooling tower's warning light will still be blinking. The quick E-Mart will still be open. Apu will be behind the counter. Burns will be in his office. Wiggum will be in his car. Bart will be on his skateboard. Lisa will be playing her saxophone. Maggie will be watching. And Homer will come through the door at 5:30, tired, a little disheveled, entirely himself. And Marge will be in the kitchen, and the house will smell like whatever she has been cooking, and the kids will be somewhere making the sounds that kids make when they are alive and present and yours. And everything will be fine. The way it is always fine in Springfield, at the end of every episode, when the reset has run and the catastrophe has dissolved, and the family is intact on the couch, it is fine. It has always been fine. Until the next episode. Until the next Sunday night. Until the next question someone looks at the show and cannot stop themselves from asking. Until then, Springfield waits. It always does. There is something worth saying about the experience of watching a show for this long. Not the experience of being a scholar of the show or a theorist or someone who has mapped its continuity contradictions with a spreadsheet. The experience of simply watching. Of coming back to the same channel on the same night and finding the same family. Most of the things we return to across a lifetime change when we return to them. The house you grew up in looks smaller than it did. The book you loved at 14 says different things to you at 35. The songs that defined particular years sound different now that you know what came after those years. Return is almost always also transformation. You are different, and so the thing is different, because the thing is partly made of who is looking at it. Springfield does not work this way. When you return to Springfield, Springfield is exactly what it was. The house is the same size. The characters say the things they always said. Homer is surprised by the same things he is always surprised by. Marge worries in the same way. Bart does the same things. Lisa raises her hand. Maggie watches. The show does not change when you change. It holds its position. It stays where it was and lets you come back to it from wherever you have been, and it receives you without commentary on how long you were gone, or how different you are now, or whether the person you have become is still someone who belongs in Springfield. You always belong in Springfield. That is one of the things the show has always known how to do. And tonight, having spent this long inside the place, having looked at it more carefully than most viewing occasions allow, I find myself thinking about what it means that Springfield holds its position not just for individual viewers, but for the culture as a whole. America has changed enormously since December 1989. The country that exists now and the country that existed when the first episode aired are connected by geography and name and some continuity of institution, but the texture of daily life, the technologies and the politics and the cultural preoccupations and the economic realities are different in ways that would be almost unrecognizable to someone who fell asleep in 1989 and woke up now. And through all of it, Springfield has remained Springfield. The plant is still cracked. Burns is still alive. Homer is still at his workstation, asleep or awake depending on the hour. Bart is still on his skateboard. Lisa is still in the corner with her saxophone. Maggie is still watching. The theories we have discussed tonight explain how Springfield maintains this impossible stability, each in its own way. The contamination that keeps the residents cognitively unable to notice that time is passing. The coma that keeps the dreamer from updating his model of the world he loves. The collective vote to maintain the comfortable fiction over the uncomfortable truth. The medical apparatus that keeps the man at the center of everything from dying and forcing the system to confront what it loses when he is gone. All of them are explanations for the same phenomenon, the same impossibility, the same fixed point in a moving world. But I think the simplest explanation is also the truest one, and it does not require any of the theories, though it does not contradict them. We kept Springfield exactly as it was because we needed somewhere to keep. In a world that changes faster than anyone can fully absorb, that produces new things and discards old things with a velocity that makes accumulation difficult and memory unreliable, the fixed points matter more than they otherwise would. The things that stay, the places you can return to and find unchanged. Springfield is one of the few cultural objects that has actually done this. That has sustained itself across a span of time long enough to have accompanied people across genuinely different phases of their lives. People who watched the first episode as teenagers now have teenagers of their own who watch the current episodes. The show has moved through generations. And within that movement it has stayed, impossibly and deliberately, the same. It is the same show. It has always been the same show. The same family on the same couch, in the same house, in the same impossible town. And whatever theories you carry out of Springfield tonight, whatever new ways of seeing the show these frameworks have opened for you, I hope you also carry this. That the 36 years of love the audience has given this show is not misplaced. Even if the show is about contamination, even if Homer is dreaming, even if the case was never really solved and Burns will live forever and Springfield will never locate itself on a map and nobody will ever age, the love is still real, the warmth is still there. The family is still, by the end of every episode, intact. And that is what we came for. That is what we always come for. The house on Evergreen Terrace, still standing. The lights on inside, the family together. Everything fine, the way it is always fine in Springfield. One last thing, before we truly go. The theories we discussed tonight, every one of them require you to take Springfield seriously. More seriously than a comedy is typically taken. More seriously than animation is typically taken. The kind of seriousness that treats the details as data and the background as information and the recurring gags as patterns worth examining rather than dismissing. Taking Springfield seriously does not mean losing the comedy. The theories do not diminish what is funny about the show. Homer throwing a donut into the reactor core to see if it grows is still funny. It is also, under the contamination theory, one more piece of evidence. Burns eating the three-eyed fish on television is still a great bit of physical comedy and satire. It is also, under the same theory, the moment a community was given the chance to ask the obvious question and collectively decided not to. The comedy and the theory coexist. They always have. The show was always doing both things simultaneously. The laughter and the darkness running alongside each other for 36 years, neither one canceling the other, both present in every episode for anyone patient enough to look for both. The theories are not a way of watching The Simpsons instead of enjoying it. They are a way of enjoying it more completely, of being in on more of what the show is doing, of watching Homer fall down and laughing and also understanding, a little more clearly, what the fall represents and why the show needs Homer to keep falling and keep getting back up. He gets back up because the dream needs him to, because the love needs him to, because the family needs him to. Because after everything, after all the safety violations and the bad decisions and the impossible recoveries and the forgotten catastrophes and the decades of contamination and the vending machine in the hospital and the 5% and the crayon and Burns and Mona and the deal and all of it, Homer Simpson gets back. Up, he gets back up, and he goes home. He always goes home. That is the show. That is all of the theories, finally in their simplest form. A man who keeps going home. And the home that keeps being there when he arrives. There is a kind of peace in that image that no theory can fully account for, and none of them try to. The theories tell you why Springfield is broken. They tell you what the contamination has done, and what the dream is made of, and who really pulled the trigger, and how the billionaire has stayed alive, and why the town keeps forgetting, and what the silence contains. They tell you what is wrong. But Homer going home is not about what is wrong. It is about what persists despite what is wrong, what continues, what reasserts itself at the end of every episode regardless of what the episode put in its way. The family is still there. The door opens. He is home. For 36 years, that has been enough. For millions of people watching on Sunday nights and weekday afternoons, and whenever the reruns are on, and now at whatever hour you are listening to this, that has been enough. It is enough. Go to sleep. Springfield will be there in the morning. It always is. Until next time, good night. Sleep well. If you made it all the way to the end, drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is. And subscribe if this is the kind of company you want to keep when the lights go down. There are a lot more impossible places left to visit.